Good afternoon. Ben Hobbs, Chair of the Market. Scott Hobbs. Session, we have two agenda items, one being the day-ahead market discussion, which will involve a relatively brief presentation by Scott Harvey and then extensive discussion, I'm sure, of the various different designs. Building upon the workshop that was held last week, which I understand was very constructive and clarifying. And then at 2:30, Gabe Murtaugh is going to be making a presentation. We'll talk about default energy bids for energy storage with a focus on how we deal with cycling costs. So at this time, I'd like to welcome Dr. Harvey.
So I've been trying to work through some of the issues and benefits of the CAISO's Option 1 and Option 2 designs. And I had two presentations posted. One was posted early last week, which is a very long set of examples. I'm not going to talk about that at all today. I thought it would be informative for people to have them. I tried to work through an example of congestion on the system and how an Option 1 design would work and an Option 2 design work in several different flavors of Option 1 designs, which I thought would be useful. I'm not going to talk about those explicitly today, but they go into and underlie some of my comments. So there's a shorter presentation that's been posted, and I'm going to talk about, again, some of the topics in that, but not go through all of the slides. So Shammy's gotten everything fixed up wonderfully over the break, so that's why we needed to take a break.
Can I do my talk again?
No.
I have a brief table there, explaining my view of the Option 2. I'm not going to go over that. So the first substantive slide here is building on some of the discussion in the workshop last week. The way I look at Option 2 is that it does, while it's designed to accommodate the CAISO market, it also, I think, accommodates the operation of a traditional utility or a load-serving entity as we have in the CAISO to meet their load at least cost consistent with past practice. I don't think that there's anything about this that really changes the way they have to operate, that the utility can use their judgment to decide how much of their intermittent energy output they should rely on in buying power from others. They can make their judgment about how much they want to expect to buy real-time economy energy as opposed to buying energy day ahead. And we make sure that there are enough resources available to make real-time load, which I think is just the way vertically integrated utilities operated for many years, that they don't always buy enough energy to cover to minimize their cost day ahead. They recognize there'll be more economy energy in real time, so they hold off on some of those purchases, but they make sure they have enough capacity or resources they can turn on to meet their load. So I think the design provides the flexibility for vertically integrated utilities in the West, as well as for California load-serving entities to manage their resources. I think there are five, as I look at it, there are 5 potential benefits, and they're potential benefits. You don't necessarily realize them from Option 2, but they're potential benefits relative to, in some cases, the current RUC design, in some cases relevant to the Option 1 design, and, they're different. Sometimes they're different benefits relevant to different options, because there are a lot of different ways of doing it. And I'm not going to talk about all these in great detail, but some of them. But to go over them, with a lot of these that the CAISO has talked about, there's going to be more efficient commitment of long start units and perhaps of some other long schedule commitments. We'll have binding day-ahead market schedules to cover all the resources needed to reliably meet the CAISO load forecast, which isn't true today under the current RUC design, and they'll have compensation for the costs they need to incur. There'll be efficient and consistent prices across the resources scheduled to meet the IFM bid load or to meet the CAISO's load forecast. Again, that isn't true under the current design. And then we'll have the assurances that resources that are committed to meet the CAISO's load forecast can be dispatched to meet that load, which we do have today under the current RUC design, but might not have under some of the option 1 designs. And in my view, we'll probably have more efficient pricing for vertical supply and demand, particularly vertical supply that requires the scheduling of additional reliability capacity. We'll see an appropriate price. Now, the first one, in terms of the more efficient commitment of long start resources, this is a potential efficiency, but of course it only, we will have more efficient commitment because we won't get into the potential of committing resources in the IFM and then committing other resources in RUC, and then knowing that actually if we looked at all that problem together, we would have made a different decision. But as Michelle's pointed out and other people have pointed out, as we have fewer long start resources, that's going to be less important. It's also less important even today to the extent we're not committing resources because of the CAISO's load forecast, but because we want more flexible capacity or something else. Because it's not clear how many of our commitments, even of long start resources, and I don't have the intimate knowledge of the CAISO and DMM of all this, but reading the things that are written, it sounds like operators are committing resources in RUC for a lot of reasons, not all of which have anything to do with the load forecast. So to the extent they're doing it for other reasons, first, A, if we can address those other reasons, we don't need to worry about the more efficient unit commitment. And B, if we don't address those other reasons, we have to recognize they're still going to do it. One way or another, if we're not getting the right resources committed in the IFM, the combined IFM, in terms of flexible capacity or whatever it is, it's still going to happen. So this is a benefit, but we have to assess how much there's going to be. The second one, which I think is important, is binding financial schedules for all resources needed to reliably meet the CAISO load forecast. And today we commit resources in RUC, and it's not just the CAISO, it's the same thing that MISO does and PJM and New York. They commit resources, they don't give them, they don't get any binding financial commitment, they don't get paid so that they can afford to schedule gas. They just get assured that they'll be able to recover their minimum load costs. And in my view, this is not working well anywhere. And it's increasingly not working well as the resource mix changes. And of course, California's got the most changed resource mix, so California is probably going to have to deal with it sooner than anybody else. Did I do that? I guess the wind stopped blowing. So I think that this is an important benefit, and I think most of the designs we're talking about will achieve it. And maybe we don't need it this month or next year, but it's going to be increasingly important to, and as the system becomes more energy limited, we have more resources that are use limited, we're going to need to provide compensation for resources to buy gas and make other commitments. So this is an important long-run benefit in my view, although I think we can achieve it with both option 1 and a number of versions of and option 2 and several versions of option 1. Michelle?
Yeah, Michelle from the CPUC, but that comes with cost, right?
Right.
So,
I'm only talking about benefits here, and I'm going to talk about negatives later. The other, I don't know, sorry. I think another important benefit that I don't think the CAISO has emphasized as much in its slides and discussion as I think is that I think it addresses some of the issues we have with the impact of virtual supply and virtual demand because of the explicit pricing of reliability capacity up and reliability capacity down. So if you have virtual supply that proxies for variable resources that are being physically withheld from the day-ahead market and are not there, then, well, when we get virtual supply that replaces them, that shouldn't force any commitment of additional resources. So we don't need, that should be treated just the same as physical load because it's moving us towards the right equilibrium. And if the price of if we don't have to buy any reliability capacity up under this design, they clear at the same price as physical capacity. But on the other hand, if we have virtual supply that's in excess of the resources that we show up in the day-ahead market and require us to buy additional reliability capacity up, then that reliability capacity up is going to have a price, and the virtual supply is going to clear at a lower price by that amount than the physical supply. So we're going to have a more efficient signal in terms of virtual supply when it's moving us closer to where the CAISO forecast output to be, and therefore isn't requiring commitment of additional units, is actually eliminating the need to have reliability commitment down. They won't pay that price, but if they're moving us in the other direction, if they're moving us towards having to make other commitments, then they're going to see a lower price, and that lower price is going to reflect the cost of other commitments. Mike?
This is Mike Castellano, CPUC. So, Scott, I agree with you that this could potentially be a good thing if it happens this way, but the formulations that I've seen and what I've thought about so far seem to have a risk that the sort of, the shadow prices on, I think the ISO is calling it sort of reliability capacity and financial capacity. The shadow prices on those two things individually may not be particularly meaningful. They could be, but depending on how bids sort of shake out and how different entities bid for the two different products, you could have a situation where one of those constraints is binding with a non-zero shadow price and the other one is binding with a zero shadow price, even though we're actually procuring some of it still. And I think
I'm not sure. I haven't worked through that hypothetically yet. I mean, I think if you're buying capacity at a positive price, it'll show up as a positive price. I mean, if it's exactly non-binding, the price is zero. I mean.
Well, so I think the concern is that if a generator submits a two-part bid for two things that it can't deliver separately necessarily, for two things that are going to generally be delivered at the same time. So the way those two constraints bind gets kind of complicated, and I think you could have situations where sort of the sum of those two shadow prices is important to ensure the generator's dispatch. But if a generator has bid $25 for financial plus $5 for whatever the other capacity is, I think as long as the sum of those two things is $30, that generator is likely to be dispatched. And I think the same kind of thing could happen, I
don't see the issue that, because a generator is not financial. A generator is a physical resource. It's making a financial commitment. It means that if it doesn't deliver, we're going to charge them.
But the bids that those generators submit could be the difference in how those two shadow prices work out, and it might not end up being particularly connected to the relative importance of those two quantities. I think there's some mathematical difficulties in there that we haven't sorted out yet.
Okay, maybe we should have an offline discussion, and that's part of the reason I put up those extended examples, because I actually think it does make sense and it does work out. There are a few places where I disagree with the CAISO on a couple elements that I'll get to, and I think it will address the things you were talking about, Paul, but the way I'll explicitly articulate the way I think about a couple of these things. So why don't we come back to this at the end and see if we're on the same page or not. Yeah. Okay, why don't we stop and take some questions on the phone.
All right, we currently have 2 questions in the queue.
Hi, good afternoon, Dr. Harvey. It's Mark with Parex. Really appreciate your slide deck today, because we've come to the same conclusion that option 2 is, A, provides substantial benefits. I think you've pointed out several of them that we see. We also see option 2 as the only one that really is going to be palatable and workable for entities across the West. So hopefully it can really, really support the broader expansion of a day-ahead organized market. But just wanted to make a comment on option 1. As you've been digging through the technical details on option 1 and really thinking it through about how you need these additional day-ahead balancing reserves, called IRU and IRUD or whatever we want to call them, those reserves are then no longer needed once you get to FMM, because they're really covering day-ahead uncertainty and the need to commit both units inside the state, but also to make sure imports are committed to carry capacity. We actually see a fatal flaw with option 1. We think that virtual bidding I know you highlight here that it won't be as efficient. We actually think that virtual supply will likely unwind the imbalance reserve.
Yeah, I heard that discussion, Mark, and I completely disagree with you. I don't think that. I think you're not understanding the role of imbalance reserves. I think them basically is flexible capacity that's scheduled in the day-ahead market, and the need for flexible capacity is not going to disappear when we get to real time. That's why the FMM price sometimes hits $750 or $1,000 because we need that capacity.
Yes.
And I disagree with the CAISO on that this stuff should settle at zero. I think the imbalance reserves need to settle against the flexible capacity price in FMM. And so I don't think there's anything here for virtual supply or virtual demand. I think it's a matter of, this is just a matter of the same thing MISO did a couple of years ago, is they took account of the flexible capacity requirement in clearing the day-ahead market. And I think that's what the CAISO is, that's what I think imbalance reserves are.
I understand what you're saying. I'd love the opportunity to have further dialogue offline, but the way we're seeing it is that in a day-ahead basis, if you have a forecast load of 40,000 megawatts and you need plus or minus 2,500 megawatts, so let's say you know that net load is going to be somewhere between 42,500 and 37,500. When you get to the FMM, the imbalance reserve need is smaller. If the new forecast is 41,000, now you might need between 40,000 and 42,000, so you only need 1,000 megawatts of up and down. So we'd love the opportunity.
But if you don't need it, you don't need it. And if they know a day ahead of time that we aren't going to need it, but suppose we do need it, then if they put in a bunch of virtual supply and we do need it, they get hosed. So if they're smarter than we are, then fine. That isn't a lie.
We strongly support the role of virtual bids, but we'd love to work through some examples with you because we are seeing it differently.
Okay.
We are seeing that we're seeing something different because the imbalance reserve need is bigger day ahead than it is when you get to real time. The flexible ramping product, for example, will be a much smaller quantity than what you need day ahead. We think that creates some unique outcomes that you don't see with contingency reserves and you don't see with energy, where the day ahead solution. That's why option 2, you will see this reliability capacity. You will periodically see a positive shadow price for that because of that difference. And so love the opportunity to some examples because initially we could see option 1 and 2 as somewhat similar. As we looked into the details, it's the same thing we're seeing today. We're seeing those out-of-market actions of exceptional dispatch, RUC, and load biasing add additional supply because of that uncertainty to the stack that changes the FMM outcome and can actually lower prices even though the load forecast might be coming in higher than forecast. You get that additional quantity coming in. So I'd love the opportunity to really walk through some examples and show what we're seeing now with option 1. Mm-hmm. The key point is we see option 2 very similar benefits to what you're seeing in terms of co-optimization, more improved virtual bidding, et cetera. But we do think that option 2, there needs to be some improvements to the formula, and we're hoping for the opportunity to discuss that at some point in the coming stakeholder processes.
So, Mark, thank you for the comment. And if I'm not mistaken, stakeholder comments are due on the 27th of this month. If that would be convenient for you, that might be a good opportunity to present some of these examples and your concerns, to clarify your concerns with option 1 and to continue this discussion. I think that might be an effective way to do it.
Thanks.
Is it indeed the 27th? Yeah, that's when comments are due. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So I think there's a benefit in terms of, as I talked about, in terms of the virtual supply. They'll provide somewhat more efficient incentives. And, as it clear in my discussion with Mark, I think that if what we're doing in imbalance reserves is scheduling capacity that will flow into real time, and it'll either be converted to energy or it'll become flexible capacity. Now, obviously, if it's converted to energy, it's not imbalance reserves, but they had to provide it, and it drives up the shadow price. And we need to have an appropriate price for flexible capacity. The idea being that if you sell us flexible imbalance reserves day ahead and you don't deliver and we need it, we're going to charge you for it. And if we need it really bad, we'll charge you a lot. And that's what we want to have to provide the incentives for people to perform in the real-time market. On the other hand, if we get to real time and it turned out our load forecast was high and we don't need it, then fine, the shadow price is zero because we don't need it. So I think these pieces hang together, and But I do have a different view from the CAISO. I think we do need to settle these products against real-time prices and obligations. And I think that's natural and easy to work out from balance reserves because they flow into FlexiRamp or flexible capacity in the FMM in real time. I think it's be more complicated for reliability capacity, because reliability capacity doesn't need to be a 15-minute product, so it shouldn't have to settle against the flexible capacity 15-minute price, but we don't have another hourly product or even 30-minute product that it could settle against. But if we're paying people for reliability capacity, we want to charge them if they don't perform, if they're not there, especially if they're not there when we need them. So that's part of the design I think we need to think through and work out, but it's not an insolvable problem. Should I stop again and ask for more questions? One more question. Okay, sorry.
Will, go ahead and put the second question through, please.
All right.
Good afternoon to all the embassy members. This is Aditya from Southern California Edison. I have two foundational questions regarding the CAISO's proposal that I was hoping you could shed some light on. My first question deals with the actual load balance, ISM load balance equations. They're actually presented on your slide 19 if you want for reference, but if you already recall them, there's no need to go there. So the load balance equation basically show that your physical energy supply is represented as a function of virtuals as well as physical load. That in turn, also the physical energy supply, feeds into the RUC equation. So essentially, your reliability capacity is a function of physical energy, which in turn is a function of virtuals. That makes RUC's capacity a function of virtuals. So this is a key concern that
I guess I don't follow that.
If you'd like to go to slide 19, it may be easier. Okay, so it's 1A and 2A that I'm talking about, and I'm not talking about the VERS and non-VER physicals, just physicals in general. Your physical energy is a function of virtuals. In other words, so is your reliability capacity. Given that,
the IFM, I don't know what you call it physical. That's okay. Equation one is the IFM load balance equation.
Yes.
It's financial.
Yes, you will put your physical supply dependent on the virtuals and the load present in the day ahead. Is that correct?
Right.
Yes. So that is a function of physical load and virtuals. So that physical energy also feeds into, it is also present in the load balance equation for the RUC. Hence, your RUC capacity is a function of virtuals as well as load.
But that's not true. 2A has no virtual load. There's physical generation. What?
How is that not true? If it is a function, if physical energy is a function of virtuals and physical load, how can, within the next equation also being true, how can it suddenly not be anymore? The variables in the second equation also
because the equation one has load, which is the load that's cleared based on the load serving entities that bid it into the day-ahead market. Equation, and it has the intermittent resources that are bid into the day-ahead market. Equation two, the whole point of it is we replace the load that the load serving entities bid into the day-ahead market with the CAISO's load forecast. And we replace the whatever intermittent cleared in the day-ahead market with the ISO's intermittent load forecast. So it's different in that we have physical non-intermittent generation, we have the CAISO's forecast of intermittent generation, and then we have the CAISO's load forecast. And if the physical generation of intermittence and other resources doesn't meet load, then we buy reliability capacity. And if the bid-in load is exactly equal to the ISO's demand forecast, and the cleared intermittence is exactly equal to the ISO's load forecast, then the net virtuals have to be zero.
You do procure reliability capacity based on the energy that is being procured, the physical energy that has been procured, yes?
No, the reliability capacity is procured in addition to the energy that's cleared in the day-ahead market. That's the point of it.
Yes.
If we don't clear enough energy in the day-ahead market to
if I might try, this has been in 1A, so let's say we have a lot more virtual supply, VEN increases and displaces TEN. So you're displacing physical supply in 1A. So you're right, you wind up getting less TEN in 2A. That's correct. But then you have to make up for it with the RCU. You are making up for it for the physical. So the total physicals will still meet your physical demand of D. I think that's your point, right, Scott?
Yeah.
So it's not as if virtual is somehow going to make less total physical resources available in 2A. You're still going to have to get D in total. But where you get them from may change.
Right. I mean, if the intermittents cleared in 1A are zero and the virtuals are half of that, then actually you're going to have more 10, the physical generation cleared is going to be more than you need.
Thank you. And the virtuals are determining how much physicals you procure. They drive the physical energy procurement, which in turn will decide how much reliability capacity you procure. That was just described by Dr. Hobbs.
Well, yes. So if you have more VEN and get less TEN, you will wind up getting more RCU. But the total physical resources, TEN plus RCU plus FIEN, et cetera, will be the same.
Right. The physicals always add up to the load forecast.
Thank you.
That's the whole point. That's true today. That's the RUC equation today, that the physicals have to add up to the load forecast.
Thank you. I get that the total will be after the load forecast, but these are still virtual driving your reliability capacity procurement. That does not make economic sense to me. The virtuals are not supposed to at least drive the reliability capacity procurement.
They don't change the amount of capacity we have in the reliability equation. They change what we might have making it up, that we might have more RCU. And I'll go back to the slide I talked with at the beginning. In 1995, a vertically integrated utility in Pennsylvania, when it decided how much power to buy in the day-ahead market, one of the things it took into account was how much economy energy it thought it was going to be able to buy really cheap the next day. And it didn't buy a lot of power at $35 if you thought it was going to get economy energy at $15 the next day. But it made sure it had enough capacity online so that the economy energy didn't show up, it could meet its load. And that's exactly what these equations do. It lets the load serving entity or the vertically integrated utility make that decision about how much they want to rely on their forecast of the intermittent load, how much supply they think is going to be available in the economy energy market, how much they think is going to be coming in from the EIM. But in the end, the CAISO also enforces equation 2 to make sure we have enough capacity to meet load, if none of that stuff shows up. But it might. You don't want to run your day-ahead market and buy high-cost energy if the odds are you're going to have very cheap economy energy or more wind the next day. You just want to be able to meet load if it doesn't show up. Mike?
Yeah, this is Mike Castellano, CPUC. Scott, I think one of the things that Aditya is maybe leading to is kind of similar to what I was saying, that using virtuals, you may be able to sort of upset the balance of physical energy and reliability capacity in 2A and sort of move around the shadow price and move around the relative pricing between these two things in ways that we should probably think about carefully. I think if you can sort of manipulate the price of reliability capacity by submitting bids for virtual load or virtual gen, that might be, we at least probably want to think about that.
Yeah, we can work that out, but I mean, I think the way it works out is if you put in a lot of virtual supply that's not going to be there, you're going to end up having to drive up the RCU, and then the price is going to be high in real time. So you're going to get paid a lower price because the shadow price on equation 1 is going to be lower, and the shadow price in equations 2 is going to be higher. And therefore, you're going to get paid a lower price for your virtual supply, and then in real time, you're going to lose because the real-time price is going to be higher. So I actually think that this equation works better in that respect than the current design.
Thank you, Doctor. And
I think that,
thank you,
Sure. I think you're making some assumptions there, Scott, that you're only looking at kind of a single transaction approach. I think we'd want to think a lot more about how you might be able to manipulate those prices to benefit in CRRs and some other things, and additionally just sort of what this reliability capacity is going to mean for, or those reliability payments are going to mean for relative cost allocation to different kinds of load and things like that.
That's another area I disagree with the CAISO, and I'm going to get to in a minute, but okay.
Dr. Harvey, thank you. Thank you.
You know, if you guys write this stuff up in your comments, we can work through it. I clearly am not on the same page with you. I don't see a problem. Actually, I see an improvement.
Wait, Dr. Harvey, am I still on?
Yeah, you're still on. And all Scott was saying is he's welcoming your comments next week. But do you have something quick to add so we can, and then we can move on?
Yes. Yeah, just another quick point. Don't need an answer right now. So basically, thank you for clarifying, and thank you to Mike as well. So the virtuals will be driving procurement as well regarding reliability capacity. And knowing that the second equation is where the capacity price that the CAISO, the additional capacity price that the CAISO plans to pay, in addition to the energy LMP, comes from virtuals can influence that. Now, my second little quick question is I'm trying to get an understanding of how this energy LMP plus this capacity shadow price, how it represents the cost of a resource. I mean, how is a resource supposed to bid knowing that instead of the LMP framework of marginal cost, now it's LMP plus some capacity? Economically, that does not make sense to me, but again, we don't need to discuss it now, but sometime during the meeting, I would appreciate some light on it. Thank you.
Yeah, actually, I think if you work through the examples that I posted on the website, I think you can see how these prices, they both basically flow back to the offer prices of the physical generators, and the physical offer price gets decomposed into a part that physical generator is reducing the need, and this is what George explained when he talked about it a couple months ago, that you can think of that physical generator as both meeting a demand in equation 1 and reducing the need for RCU in equation 2. So the sum of those two shadow prices has to cover the offer price in the day-ahead market. And as I illustrate in the example, you can get situations where the sum of the two shadow prices is actually higher than the offer prices of some of the resources. They actually earn an opportunity cost. But it really is, there's a terminology. I actually think of the sum of the two as really being the day-ahead market price. George thinks of it as just the shadow price of equation 1 being the energy price. But I think of it more as the sum of the two, and the RCU, the shadow price of the second equation, or the RCU price, is the price of reliability capacity. And
so it's no longer,
if you're buying extra.
I was just saying, so it's no longer a marginal cost energy market anymore, is what you're saying.
I'm sorry, I couldn't make that out.
Sorry, all I was saying is, so you're saying it's no longer a marginal cost energy market because you're saying
I'm saying it is, but they're two shadow prices that add up to the price, or you can say that just the sum of those two shadow prices is the price. It's a matter of semantics, and you could also formulate these equations differently so that you wouldn't you wouldn't have to add them together. It's just a matter of the way George chose to formulate it, and I thought it'd be the path of least resistance is not to formulate it a different way, but it's mathematically equivalent. So, but I think if you look back at the examples, I think you'll see that this works out. You can send me an email if you still have questions. Carrie.
This is Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. Can you go back to the slide you were presenting on?
Yeah.
I'm still a little confused about this because I think whether it's more efficient or not, unfortunately, has to do with the RA market. Because if you have virtual supply and you go into ROC and you have RA resources bidding at zero and the CAISO in ROC counts short start units, it doesn't add in that commitment cost into ROC. Essentially, it's deemed as free because it's paid for by the RA market. So on this, though, you would include those commitment costs. For every net megawatt of virtual supply, you essentially, on the margin, like your slide said, you have to increment up some reliability capacity. And now those costs are charged to the market. So in my thinking, the extent to which it's more efficient is whether that's already been paid for by load-serving entities as a fixed cost, or whether now we're going to include it within the energy market.
I guess maybe I should have worked through some of these examples, but I think this is the same question we're talking about. If you think
it's not. I worked through your examples. I emailed you. I worked through your examples.
Okay,
you know I did.
Examples.
I was emailing you at like 10 p.m. at night. No. So today, the key is short start resources are taken as free by ROC.
Right.
Completely
they still
free.
Will. If all we need is short start resources, the only thing they'll bid in is their cost of getting gas, right?
Well, no, they'll bid, no, and O&M, right? The short start resources will have their startup and minimum load costs.
They get paid for energy when they start up. What the flexible capacity bid should just recover the cost of scheduling gas or posturing your Cascade River system or telling your demand response that needs to be able to respond. You're not paying them to respond. You're saying, what cost do you have to incur today so that if I say jump tomorrow, you can?
But so this is a full optimization. So let's say I'm a short start resource and I bid in 1 megawatt of reliability capacity. The optimization is going to incur the cost of turning me on.
No. If you're short start,
no?
No, because
that's not how George has formulated it. When I walked through it with George, he says, yeah, the optimization would turn on the resource.
In the RUC path, but not in the physical.
But now there's no RUC path and there's no physical path. It's a dual constraint that are being met at the same time. So how do you not turn on a short start unit if you're meeting a dual constraint? Because
I think we need some terminology here, but there are two load balance equations. Units can be on to meet one load balance equation and off to meet the other. So anybody that's providing RCU, we have to turn them on in equation 2A to meet the physical load balance, but we don't have to turn them on in the IFM. We're not buying their energy. We're just saying we turn them on at the cost. We turn them on by paying them their cost of getting gas. So we don't actually pay their startup costs until we need them in real time. So but their cost, basically the dispatch price, is how much do I have to pay you so that I can turn you on? And when we're dispatching you in that equation too, we're just saying I'm dispatching you to provide to provide reliability capacity, which means the cost I incur on a short start unit is just your flexible capacity bid, the cost to you of being ready to jump when I tell you to. But I'm not telling you to jump until real time. RTPD or stuck will tell you to jump. And at that point, we're going to have to take account of your commitment costs. But we might not need you.
I mean, this is odd because I don't think you could have it both ways. I don't think I could buy PowerX's argument that you're now ensuring that you have sufficient commitment costs covered in the day-ahead market to show up in real time, and by your argument that I only need to cover my gas and I could be taken for 1 megawatt of reliability capacity. And this kind of goes back to the morning's argument,
right? But then we turn you on if we need you. And if we need you, we're going to pay you your startup costs. But we aren't going to pay you your startup costs in the IFM because we may not need you.
See, I think maybe that's a more reasonable argument, but what I've been hearing over and over again is this is going to ensure that you have paid for those resources in the day ahead.
Not paid for their energy, you've paid for the costs of being available. Just like with reserves, we don't pay for the reserves the cost of what we have to pay them if we activate them. We pay them the cost so that they'll be available in real time.
So you're going to pay a resource, just to make sure I understand, because I think there's a big disconnect. So if a resource bids in 100 megawatts at $5 for this reliability capacity product, then they'll get paid the $5 in the day ahead, but there's no recovery of commitment costs or anything like that. It's only if they get turned on in the real time that you would pay for that. It's
only if they're a long start unit that we have to turn them on, then, and that's the difference of the combined design, because it will recognize that the commitments have to be the same in the two equations. The current design, we have two equations that are separated in time. So we solve the first one, and we have some long start units in it, the IFM, and later we solve RUC. And if we put on a long start unit in RUC, it wasn't on in the IFM. This version, we're going to have the same state. All the long start units are going to be the same state in both equations. So if we need a long start unit to meet equation 2, it's also going to be on in equation 1.
But how am I supposed to bid for reliability capacity now? If you could take me for 1 megawatt, but you're telling me I'm supposed to cover my gas for up to PMIN, what do I bid?
Does the PMIN still appear in the reliability energy? So it's still infeasible to be producing below PMIN and the reliability energy constraints. Would that be the case?
Yeah, I mean,
would that prevent the 1 megawatt?
We haven't gotten down all. I note in this I said, there's some additional links we're going to have to put between the two equations, and one might be that will require that you be scheduled for your full. Quick start units are scheduled for their full capacity in equation 2. But as I said, I think there are some other links that haven't been laid out yet that we're going to have to put in. But I'm not trying to get down to all of those links at this point. So you might, so if you're just dispatching it incrementally, then we only need to buy X megawatts of gas. If we've got a unit that has a minimum load that they have to buy so much gas to operate at minimum load, maybe we'll put that constraint in, that we only schedule them for RCU capacity up to that amount.
I think maybe some people are struggling on the load side because they're thinking about what do I have to pay and how do I bid this in, and without those links, it seems a little bit nonsensical. Right. But I think I'm seeing that maybe you could add some more equations and maybe this would make a little more sense.
Yeah, and if you think about it as long as you can buy, if the unit is just dispatchable incrementally, you can just buy the amount of gas you need. And then if we got a unit that has a minimum load block for gas as well as its operation, maybe we have to put in a constraint for that. Do you still have a question, or you?
Roger Avalos, CMM. You sort of covered it, but talking about would you have to go further into the constraints? Because when I saw the presentation from George, I was under the impression that in order to provide reliability energy, you had to be committed in IFM, in which case those costs are considered, and then including PCR and all that. I think that's what Carrie was getting at, but again.
Yes, thank you, Roger.
It seems like you're saying that's not the case. So I think that's a detail that needs to be worked out, and I think you've covered.
Yeah, I think that's true for long start units, but I don't think it's true for other units because you don't necessarily need them.
Right,
it's like flexible re-up, offline units. We have offline units providing flexible capacity, and we don't start them. They're in FMM that we could start them.
No, but I understand the reality is different. Like, you don't have to start them. So like in RUC right now, if you commit a bunch of short starts, we never start them, they don't get any PCR, they don't have any commitment costs, nothing like that. But I don't think there's any differentiation between long start, short start, commitment decisions in the current formulation. So like if you do commit, at least the way I read it, you do commit short start resource to meet reliability energy, those commitment costs are included in optimization.
Yeah, if he's formulating that way, that's not right. We have to talk.
Right, and I think that's what Carrie was getting at, so that's something that should be looked at.
But I think that's just talking shorthand, and I think from what I heard, I think he's he has in mind the long start units, and he just isn't laying out. I don't think he probably picked up that was confusing.
So Roger, you're referring to his June document? Perhaps, or
I don't remember. It's been a year and a half, so.
Yeah, it's pretty condensed. It's left out a lot of
I mean, that's the problem with just having a few equations. It'd be a little more text description. This might help everybody.
What's pharmacy? Scott, can you clarify when you said what part you didn't, or you do not agree with the Kaiser proposal?
I'm going to get there. Okay.
Okay.
I've said a couple. One thing I don't agree with is I think we have to settle in real time. I'm going to get to another in a couple minutes. Are we clear on the phone for now? Okay. So I think there are a few challenges, I think, to get to the other side of it, as Michelle asked me to, and I can talk about some of them. Some of them I think you can just read it. It's straightforward. I think one of the key issues is just, can we do it? What are the impacts on solution time of doing it? And I think that's really the first thing we have to be sure of, or at least be reasonably confident of, that we can implement this, and that the implementation will not have such severe impacts on solution time that we're worse off. Now, it has the potential to improve solution time, because actually, compared to now, you won't have to run 2 passes, an IFM pass and a RUC pass. You're just going to do it combined. But there are some solution challenges. And I know that the original reason the sequential approach was developed was because the vendors said they didn't know how to solve the combined problem. But now it's later, but I think it's got some challenges. So that's, I think, the first question that the CAISO has to work down the road a little bit is, can we solve this on a constrained network with all these things that have to be enforced between the 2 solutions? And so that's a qualification, but it's not anything negative about it, just something we have to make sure we can do. I think the market power mitigation, we have to deal with it. I don't think there's anything real complicated about that at this point, so I'm not going to spend time on it. This is one of the issues that we've been talking about. My concern about the equations is that we've been talking about just equation 1 having just energy, but it's actually got cleared energy on thermal units and cleared energy on intermittent units. And the load balance equation 2, the output of the intermittents that clear in equation 1 isn't in there, and it's just the CAISO's load forecast. So if a generator gets paid lambda for the shadow price of equation 1 for its output that's cleared in the IFM, and only gets paid the shadow price of equation 2, if it's in equation 2, that means that all intermittent resources that clear in the day-ahead market would get paid less than thermal resources, which isn't the right answer. And I think there are ways to solve this. I talk about a couple possibilities and over the next couple of pages, but we need to think through them. Their alternative approaches have impacts. So I think the CAISO needs to talk a little bit about how exactly are we going to compensate the intermittents. The amount that they're bid in the day-ahead market and the CAISO's forecast. We don't want to pay them if they bid more than the ISO's forecast in, so that the ISO ends up committing forecast load for them, but on the other hand, we don't want to pay them less than their value. So that's an issue that needs to be worked through. And these sort of talk about that problem. I'm sorry, Carrie?
Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. So it seems like you're skipping through these very quickly, so I'll just say I appreciated them, and that's good. And while you're thinking about that, can you think about storage too? Because it seems like storage is going to be paid lambda, but then pay XC to charge. So to me, I think there's a disconnect there if your discharge is paid, I guess under the current formulation, the sum of the shadow prices, but then because it's load, it would just charge at lambda, or the first shadow price. So that's confusing to me too.
Well, I mean, it depends if it were charging in the day-ahead market and if it's both charging and discharging in the day-ahead market,
which it will,
then I think the prices will cancel out. And it wants to charge in an hour in which lambda is low, and
I'm not sure because they're saying it's going to be allocated outside the market, right?
What is allocated?
The reliability charge.
Okay. Now we got to the second one. That's the other place where I disagree.
But that's the proposal.
I think the way I look at these, as I said, I think basically if you look at the examples I put out, you can see that if a physical generator clearing in IFM gets paid the sum of the two shadow prices, that will generally equal its incremental cost if it's marginal. In a few cases, it'll be higher than its incremental cost because there's an opportunity cost of providing the RCU, the reliability capacity up. So that works perfectly. And then I think that when you get to load, the cost to load should be the shadow price of equation 1 in the day-ahead market, and then all load that consumes in real time should pay the shadow price of equation 2. So that means that real load that bids in the day-ahead market and consumes in real time pays the sum of the two shadow prices. Load that doesn't bid in the day-ahead market and shows up in real time pays the real-time marginal cost plus the shadow price of reliability capacity up, the shadow price of equation 2. If conditions are unchanged between the day-ahead and real time, the sum of the shadow prices in the day-ahead market should be roughly equal to the marginal cost of energy in real time, which means that load that doesn't clear in the day-ahead market and waits till real time, and as a result causes the ISO to have to schedule reliability up capacity, will pay more than the load that cleared its entire load in the day-ahead market, which is good. But it'll be fair. Just like it'll be fair to virtual supply that if they force the ISO to commit additional reliability capacity up, they won't get paid as much as physical generation. But that's where I disagree with, I think, what the ISO said. I don't think we should socialize the cost of equation 2. I think it works out perfectly if you charge real-time load, the shadow price of equation 2, and then the only uplift you've got is the part of the ISO's forecast that is greater than the physical load that showed up, because that is uplift. That's the ISO's mistake, or the ISO's uncertainty. And that's an uplift that everybody has to share. But I think the other part can be directly allocated to the loads, and I think by doing that, it actually provides efficient incentives for load-serving entities to clear their load in the day-ahead market, as long as if they would otherwise be forcing us to buy additional reliability capacity up.
Sorry.
There were I know there's several hands over here.
Well, I was just going to point out, you got to it eventually, the uplift that occurs in that situation if the CAISO over-forecasts.
I personally think that you ought to have to pay the CAISO's mistakes cost, but we'll allocate it all.
Going to get billed to PI Consulting. But one of the things that gets at to me is, why are we doing all this? Is this really so much better than just having load the way it is now and putting a flexible ramping product in the day ahead?
But we still have to uplift the cost of RUC today. And if we get a resource mix that it's more and more important that they schedule gas or they posture their cascade hydro system, or we rely more on demand response, and demand response needs a little something day ahead so that they can activate in real time, then the current framework isn't going to cut it. And other places are looking at the same issue, that as the gas system becomes more constrained and we've got more energy limited resources, everybody's getting, then there's less latent capacity on the grid. Everybody's getting more and more and more nervous about not having, just saying, oh, we'll put this stuff on and hope that there's gas and this and that.
But if we have a flexible ramping product in the day ahead, and we don't have this reliability capacity stuff in the day ahead or in the IFM, I think we end up at basically the same place we can end up at the same place statistically that we do with the reliability capacity, and it removes
two things.
so many of the pricing issues.
Flexible capacity is going to be 15-minute dispatchable, and that was one of the things I worked through in those examples, that saying we're going to meet the reliability capacity need with 15-minute flexible capacity can drive up the energy price, because we're going to have to back more units down out of merit in real time to have, or in the day-ahead market, to provide flexible capacity, when the reliability capacity can probably be met with units that can be there in an hour or 30 minutes. So that's the nature of the flexible capacity requirement. It's 15-minute dispatchable capacity. We'd have to potentially commit more units in order to have flexible dispatchable capacity than say we can turn on slower units in real time.
I think if we schedule it in day ahead, you should be able to do those things without too much complication. It depends on how you define the flexible ramping product and the requirements for that. And I think if you do it that way, it just becomes so much simpler from a pricing standpoint. You don't have to worry about this allocation. You don't have to worry about what are the differences between the CAISO forecast and what shows up.
You still have to worry about the forecast. It just changes how much.
You don't have to worry about it in the price.
Right, but I think the price has to be higher because you're making it more restrictive. I agree.
I think
if we can do all of it with 15-minute capacity, that's fine, but I don't think it makes it any cheaper. I think it works out exactly the same.
Well, so it might not make it any cheaper overall, assuming everybody bids the right way and everything falls out the way it should, but I think taking that additional sort of pricing lever out of there simplifies things. If we go back to Jim's presentation earlier and we want to talk about forward contracting, given the sort of mix of RA contracts that are out there right now, then we have no idea what's going to be going on with what people are going to be bidding for this capacity product. Depending on whether, exactly how that gets allocated out to load, that's going to have an impact on sort of what load is willing to pay for a forward contract, and it might have, Gen isn't going to want to sell their forward power for less than they think it's worth, and load isn't going to want to pay more than they think they'll have to pay in the long run. So, removing some of those pricing discrepancies from the final market is, I think, going to be helpful in a lot of ways, and it'll also take out some other ways that people could potentially manipulate the market.
Yeah, we can, as I said, you can reformulate these equations so that you just have a shadow price of energy that the sum of the shadow prices of equation 1, and then you just buy an amount of extra capacity that gets paid the shadow price 2. And that, if the world, it's just going to be so complicated for people, George's equations can be reformulated that way. But I think it actually, what becomes more complicated if you do that is the treatment of virtual demand and virtual supply. That, we'd have to explicitly then have a charge for virtual supply that, okay, supply clearing, physical supply clearing in the day-ahead market, we'd reformulate it so the sum of the two shadow prices equaled what they got paid, but then we'd have to subtract the price of flexible capacity from virtual supply. But, I think the two formulations are the same. That basically you can rework his equations and reformulate it a different way, and instead of the solution to one equation being the sum of the two shadow prices, just one shadow price and the other is a shadow price, and I think it's the same answer.
So I'm just getting back to the current formulation. I don't know what the other one. And you're saying that you allocate, you just charge the real-time load, the day-ahead reliability, and shadow price.
Day-ahead load is there in real time. All real-time load, and by real-time load I mean anything that sucks power off the system, whether it's scheduled in the day-ahead market or not, pays. Right.
So it pays the reliability shadow price. There's just some weirdness in the pricing that I can't get over. So, if I self-schedule generation and load at the same node, what's my settlement? And say I self-schedule
the way I think it's zero, because you get paid the sum of the two shadow prices, and we're going to charge you the sum of the two shadow prices.
So say I self-schedule them both in day ahead, and then I just zero both schedules out in real time. What's my end settlement?
I mean, if you don't consume, what do you mean?
I don't. I stick in self-schedule for a generator and say a virtual demand bid, same megawatts, same location, real time, I don't deliver any energy, I don't turn my generator on, and my virtual supply is obviously, demand is obviously zero. What's my net settlement?
It'll depend on...
I'm pretty sure it's just the shadow price positive and pay the shadow price on the reliability energy constraint. That's just weird that you can do that.
So I think it actually nets to zero, but that's...
No, because you're saying you charge the REN shadow price to whatever basically the meter load is, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Their meter load's zero because there's a virtual demand.
Right.
And their generator...
But the virtual supply only gets paid...
No, it's a physical generator you sell schedule.
Oh, then the physical generator should get paid more, right? It should get paid lambda plus epsilon.
Obviously, this is an implicit virtual bid. So he self-schedules day ahead, doesn't show up in real time on purpose because they know he's going to be out of money anyway. He just gets paid the REN shadow price.
No. He gets paid lambda plus, he gets paid the shadow, some of the two shadow prices in the day-ahead market.
Right.
And then he pays the real-time price for what he doesn't deliver.
Right, that's offset by the virtual demand. Like they're matched, right? Like both the virtual demand and the energy schedule offset in real time. So where the LMP is in real time, they offset to zero.
So you're saying but the virtual demand price in the day-ahead market, if the RCU is positive, will be the sum of the two shadow prices. So you get paid
the virtual demand doesn't show up in the second equation.
No, I'm just saying the first equation. You get paid nothing day ahead, and then you get paid nothing in real time.
So what's the virtual demand charged in day ahead? It's just the financial power balance constraint shadow price. The generator is paid that shadow price plus the reliability energy shadow price. And then in real time, they buy them both back to the same price. All he's left over is his day-ahead schedule for supply times the reliability energy shadow price.
Okay.
This is where a blackboard would be quite useful. And not having a blackboard comments
plus two shadow prices in day ahead. It's for the generator minus one shadow price. And in real time, it's the same price. So that real time is just zero settlement.
You need some sort of no pay.
So this is Don from the ISO. I think what it's getting to is why Scott wants to do the resettlement, so that generator, physical generator, would have to buy back at the real time.
At the day-ahead REN price?
At the real-time FRP price, basically, if you did the deviation settlement.
The FRP is a completely different constraint.
Well, I said we don't have an analogy in real time for the real time.
That's kind of what I'm getting at.
I said we have to have a penalty for if you don't show up to provide reliability capacity. But I don't think we should just say that you're off the hook if you don't deliver. Just like if you don't deliver flexible capacity, we have to settle it up.
Well, how would you say you didn't deliver because I wasn't scheduled for energy? I mean, what if I just bid 1,000 in real time?
But we're going to give you a reliability schedule. That's the point. Is there's now a reliability schedule with a binding financial commitment. If you don't show up in real time, you have to settle at the real time price.
The energy price?
No, the price of the capacity, the flexible capacity in real time.
I'm not talking about
and the virtual would not earn that then. The virtuals.
Well, there's no flexible capacity for this guy at all. Right.
But that's why I said about 30 minutes ago. I said we've got a natural price for the flexible capacity. It's for imbalanced reserves. It's flexible capacity price. And I said for the reliability capacity, we need a price, but we don't have one because we don't have anything like 30-minute reserves.
Right. We don't have a constraint. It's already forecast in real time. There is no analogous bid-in demand versus forecast demand constraint that exists. There's no bid-in demand in real time. I don't know how you're going to come up with a real-time.
Well, for example, I don't know, as Kerry or somebody said, we could settle it against the FlexiRamp price. So if we were really tight on supply in real time, the FlexiRamp price would be really high, which it would be. If we needed this guy and he failed to show up with his reliability capacity, then the FlexiRamp capacity price would be really high, and we'd charge them a lot of money, but I'm saying that might be too high.
So what if somebody just doesn't clear their REM schedule in real time because they weren't needed, and the FlexiRamp price is high, then they're getting, seems like you're hosing them for no reason, like they were just bidding.
I'm sorry, I don't understand.
Well, you're saying that
if we don't need them,
you're saying if they produce energy below their REM schedule, that you're going to charge the FlexiRamp price. I don't understand why that makes any sense.
If they're not there when we call it, they're not there to provide reserves or to provide FlexiRamp. If we suppose we transition the requirement, or as somebody said, suppose we said it all has to be 15-minute dispatchable. We keep it simple. Then obviously we could shuttle that at the 15-minute price. And if they weren't there, if they weren't able to provide FlexiRamp, they'd have to buy back their schedule.
So that's assuming that all resources are 15-minute committable and dispatchable, right? Like, how would you decide who didn't deliver or wasn't able to deliver? They could have been bidding the whole time. There are people who aren't trying to do this game. How would you decide that they weren't?
But we just talked about a design in which we said it would be that we could use 15-minute dispatchable capacity.
In day ahead.
In day ahead, which means it should be 15-minute dispatchable in real time.
Right, but what if it takes them 2 hours to?
Well, then they can't meet this requirement.
So we're only going to meet it with guys. So the reliability energy is going to be met by people who are committable in 15 minutes.
That's what I said about an hour ago. I said I don't.
How many? Not very many resources are committable in 15 minutes.
Yeah, I know, and that's what I said. I think we ought to have a different requirement for the reliability capacity up. I think it ought to be longer. It ought to be resources that be committed inside and out. And I said that's where we got a complication, because while we got a natural price in real time for the 15-minute imbalanced reserves, because we got a 15-minute price, we don't have a 30-minute reserve price or an hour reserve price in real time. So we have to come up with another way to settle it.
So you're saying,
and I haven't come up with the answer yet. Right. I mean, I think there are things we could do, like look at forward prices in the HASP or whatever, but we haven't got that answer. And I think we need to settle the imbalanced reserves day-ahead market schedule against something. And I'm not standing up here telling you what that something is. I'm just saying we need to come up with a price to settle that imbalance against if you don't provide it.
I guess my point is, without a real analogous constraint, which I don't think there is one, because there's no bid in demand in real time. So like this data constraint is just the difference between bid in and forecast. There's only forecast in real time. I don't think we can come up with a constraint or price that isn't at least largely arbitrary. It's not going to be like it is now. You have power balance constraints, congestion prices, conditions change real time. Those prices all make sense to me. This seems there's no natural settlement price.
There are lots of settlement prices we could use. We could decide it's the price of 10-minute spin, or we could decide, say it's
right. And to me, it seems very arbitrary and like going to undercount it or over-penalize people who are just.
Right now, the price is zero. There's no ruck penalty price. I think it'd be better to have a penalty price even if it's imperfect. But I agree, I don't see a perfect way to define the imbalance price for the reliability capacity, and that we ought to have one.
So we have a question. The phones. We also have two hands in the audience. Let's take the two hands. Go ahead. Carrie Bentley with Western Power Trading Forum. So you got really excited in answering my story about what you saw as a flaw, but I think your fix for that, if I understood it, would be that if you're storage, you would be paid the sum of the shadow prices for your discharge, and then ultimately you would pay the real-time price, real-time load price?
No, if you were both, it depends on what you actually do in real time. But suppose you did follow your day-ahead schedule, then I think it nets out and you basically pay the difference in the land. But all it also depends on what the reliability the prices are in the two passes.
If you think about how we model storage today, we model it as negative gen when it's charging. You would do the same thing. So you would pay both of the shadow prices for it.
So you would have storage pay the sum of the shadow prices?
Right.
To charge?
Negative generation.
Different price than all
a different price than all other load?
That sounds problematic.
So the bid-in load would be correct. Bid-in load just uses the first power balance equation.
So There's a lot of problems with that.
Pay the remainder in uplift in real time.
So then behind the meter storage would potentially be cheaper than storage that's on the grid?
And how would you optimize? Okay, I think this illustrates a great point, which I would like to make. It sounds like there are a lot of fixes for all the issues that many people in this room have. I just wonder, by the time we go through and we fix all these things, if a very smart PhD economist cannot explain it clearly and succinctly, and very smart PhD economists on this side of the room don't quite understand it, how workable of a market structure it is. Mm-hmm. That's my big ask here.
And I still think, this is Mike Castellano with CPUC, I still think it's just so much easier to get rid of the reliability capacity and just have a flexible ramping product in the day ahead, and I think statistically we can get to the same place.
So I think the thing, if we do it that way, we have to schedule the flexible capacity has to be the amount we need to meet the imbalance. It has to satisfy that equation too. And then what you're just saying, all you're saying really is we're going to schedule flexible capacity that's going to have to meet the flexible capacity requirements, and if that's not burdensome, fine. I just think that the requirement that it be 15-minute dispatchable could end up being very expensive, but it may not be. And I think that for one thing, it's going to be more problematic, I think, to schedule flexible capacity on the ties on a 15-minute basis than on an hourly basis, than reliability capacity with an hourly schedule, but maybe not. And that's not I don't view that as intrinsic. If you felt it was going to be just as cheap to schedule all its flexible capacity, fine. I just have a feeling it would be cheaper for loads to go with capacity that's available on a longer time frame to provide the reliability capacity, but if that's not true, there's no reason to do it.
Actually, just a clarification question. So I think you mentioned something about the day-ahead FRP set on the real-time market prices. I'm not really understand. So say, for example, day-ahead energy clears at $30, and FRP, the reliability capacity price is $10, so the total price is $40. And in the real-time market, you also got a $40 in total, but the split between the two becomes different. Say $10 for energy and $30 for the capacity. What's your proposal? I mean, I don't understand what. I was starting for imbalance reserves. The price, I think the price of imbalance reserves in the day-ahead market should reflect the cost of scheduling flexible capacity to be available. In my example, it's $10 in the day-ahead.
Okay, suppose it's $10 in day-ahead because they have to schedule gas, and maybe it's cheaper in real time because they don't have to schedule gas. But also you have to dispatch people out of merit in real time, so there's some cost in real time. And if it's low, then fine. If we pay them $10 day-ahead, it turns out it's only worth 50 cents in real time. They don't deliver, or they get converted to energy, we charge them 50 cents. But if we actually, suppose we do need them real time, suppose the FMM interval, the price goes to $750, all the flexible capacity is converted to energy at a penalty price of $247, then they buy out of it at $247.
So basically you price the day-ahead FRP, but you do not use that to settle for settlement purpose. Is that what you're suggesting?
You pay them just like energy, you pay them the day-ahead market price for their energy, and then if they don't deliver it in real time, they pay the real-time price to settle their imbalance.
Okay, so in day-ahead settlement, you still pay them the day-ahead energy, day-ahead for the reliability.
Right, and then settle their deviations at the real-time price.
Okay, and for the load, you only settle on the real-time.
We pay them the energy price day-ahead, but we could settle the shadow price of the reliability capacity based on their real-time consumption.
Okay.
Well, you probably could do that. I think it works out better that way, but I think there's probably more problems if you charge them the day-ahead price, charge them that's the second shadow price of their day-ahead schedule, even if they don't consume it in real time. But we could, that's something to think through. I think that's actually more of a problem, but
Okay. Oh, I think there's still a disconnection, though. Thanks.
Okay, there's one person on the call.
Lauren, can you put the caller through, please?
Hi, good afternoon, Dr. Harvey. It's Malcolm with PowerX again. Just a few thoughts. One is that I largely agree with what you're explaining here, and I think we shouldn't get lost in some of the details that need to be worked out. And I think I agree with your point in terms of the imbalance charge if someone sells RCU and doesn't show up. Yes, we need to figure that out, but we've had to figure that out for things like spin and non-spin and what happens if someone sold spin and we're not talking about energy deployment, but wasn't available. You know, there's this clawback all the way back to the last time they sold spin. For energy imbalance on intertide deviations, we now have a penalty framework that's coming into place. And so I think it's an issue that needs to be worked out. But again, it's about non-performance of capacity that's been sold. What's the right imbalance charge to correctly incent the behavior for entities to show up? I think that what is very different about option 1 and option 2, and I know you highlighted a lot of the benefits of option 2, is option 2 is recognizing that while the financial power balance equation with virtuals is determining the day-ahead energy solution, and there's a lot of benefits to that, this is ensuring that this constraint ensures what the capacity is that is committed. And what we're seeing today is this is happening anyways, but in a very inefficient way. When you don't have this type of constraint, what ends up happening is we end up with exceptional dispatches and load biasing because the operators aren't comfortable with the day-ahead solution rolling into the FMM, not having enough upward headroom in case the net load does come in high, so they're requiring it anyways, but in a very inefficient way. We're loading up resources for energy in the day-ahead market, and then afterwards we're saying, well, what's left over that we can rock? What's left over that we can exceptionally dispatch or load bias to create this upward headroom? This is recognizing that as those imbalance reserve needs continue to grow, the CAISO, as the reliability entity, needs to acquire and ensure there's sufficient capacity on the system. It's far better to do that through a co-optimized approach that recognizes the CAISO's role in ensuring sufficient capacity while still letting the market decide the energy deployment day ahead. Without this constraint, we're back in the situation that we only have a power balance for energy. If the CAISO, even with a flexible ramping product, if they come out of that without enough capacity and total committed, we're going to be right back into a load biasing and an exceptional dispatch to fill the gap.
Mike?
I think, Mark, this is Mike Castellano with the CPUC. I don't really see how that's different than the situation with the reliability capacity. I think there are going to be plenty of times where the operators might see that amount and think it's not enough, and I think there are going to be plenty of times where with the flexible capacity they could see that and be totally comfortable. I think that's a little bit, a bit of an arbitrary line to draw to say if we call it reliability capacity and do it this way versus if we call it flexible capacity and do it another way, that the operators are going to view it completely differently.
I think the difference is that when you have this second constraint, you ensure that the sum of these resources that you see, the reliability capacity plus the physical energy, meets the CAISO's demand. Now, we think there can be improvements to this formula, but you know that you have sufficient physical resources, including the flexible ramping or imbalance reserve up, and I do think that the RCU can save significant costs because it doesn't all have to be 15-minute product. You end up ensuring that you have enough physical resources committed in the day-ahead co-optimized solution to meet the CAISO's forecast. When you don't have this equation, you know you have enough flexible reserves for the flexibility piece, but your commitment of physical resources may end up well short of what the CAISO forecasts, and you're going to be right back into out-of-market actions.
Yeah, but, I think it's still unclear whether a lot of the out-of-market actions are due to worries about forecast load or they're worries about not enough ramp capacity. And I think we've got to recognize that, in reality in RUC, not everything is being committed in RUC because of being forecast load. I think a lot of it is to get flexible units on, and we have to make flexible ramp work in real time before we're going to realize these benefits. Because if the operators still see it isn't there in real time, they're going to keep doing things. So, this is only part of the puzzle. We have to make FlexiRamp work in real time so that the operators are comfortable they're going to have it, because if they aren't, they're going to do things. We know they're going to do it, and they'll need to do it. Okay, are there anybody else on the phone? Okay. So I got out the other thing that I don't agree with, which is that I think the cost of the reliability capacity shouldn't be socialized, but should largely charge to the real-time load, and that the error, the part that we get by that's extra because the CAISO's forecast is too high, that will need to be socialized, which gets to the remaining couple of issues here that are not, they're just challenges. They're things we have to take seriously. I think that the one impact of the combined approach is, and it's also under some of these option one approaches, but the CAISO's load forecast is going to have more market impact. So it's something the CAISO's going to have to be comfortable with, and the market participants are going to have to be comfortable with, and I don't think, the CAISO can have a mechanical approach. I think there's going to have to be judgment applied, and what's a reasonable forecast, and that may make people uncomfortable. So it's going to have market impacts. It can, because there's potentially an interaction between the price of reliability capacity up or flexible capacity up and the price of energy, but especially the difference between doing it in two separate processes and combining it. There's going to be more interaction, so the CAISO's forecast has become more important. I also think that the imbalance reserves penalty price is going to be significant. We have to think when we start scheduling RUC and the imbalance reserves in the day-ahead market, there's more potential for all of those things to add up to a high number relative to supply and drive up the price. We'll just drive up the price of imbalance reserves and FlexiRamp, but we ought to think about what is the shadow price of the imbalance reserve? Should it really be $247? Do we want the price to go to the clearing price of energy plus $247 if we don't have enough to meet the CAISO's load forecast plus the flexible capacity up requirement? And thirdly, as I work through in the examples, I think that there's a potential for this design to be a lot cheaper if we can schedule reliability capacity on the interties rather than having to schedule it all inside California on high load days. But that gets to the kind of problems Michelle has raised. We don't want to have a new thing that we pay for and then it doesn't show up. So we're going to have methods of accounting and settling the reliability capacity on the interties or imbalance reserves on the interties and having comfort that it's there. And again, to go back to the operators, if they don't have any if they don't have confidence that the reliability capacity or imbalance reserves in the ties is there, then they'll want to commit additional units inside. So that's all I was planning to talk about because I think it took longer than 10 minutes. But should we check one last time for the phone and then give people a pass in the room? No. Last chance in the room?
Roger Avalosky, man. This is not exactly related to your discussion, which is mainly about the integration of RUC versus non-integration, but for the flexible reserves in general, DNM is very concerned about whether they'll be deliverable in real time and whether real time will hold them after we procured them in day ahead. And, if you go back to when we had FlexRamp constraint, we had a problem where they procured in the 15-minute market, but then RTD would release it, because it didn't know there was a requirement. We want to make sure that, we're thinking about, are there any changes to real-time FRP that can be done to ensure that real-time doesn't, give away the flexible capacity at 3 hours out, for these, because one of the bigger problems for ramp isn't really 15-minute to 15-minute exactly. It's, there's uncertainty of what the whole load ramp's going to be over like a 3-hour period as the sun's coming off. And that's what operators, I think, and I can't get in their minds too much, but I think that's what they're concerned about is a 3-hour ramp, not 15-minute ramp. And I think if you get the day-ahead right, the day-ahead can set you up, but if we don't want real time to unwind it because it doesn't feed them.
I agree totally. That's exactly what my comments were targeted at. I'm afraid that the real problem is in the real-time flexi ramp right now, and that's driving all these problems, and I don't think it's been fixed.
Right, and currently, I think the ISO even had a presentation on this a couple of years ago now about a lot of the flex ramps behind transmission constraints not deliverable anyway. And, well, I think one of the benefits to the combined approach is you get deliverable reliability.
No. They say it's going to be deliverable, but they haven't, the CAISO has not yet told us how we're going to ensure it's going to be deliverable.
I think, yeah, because they're treating it just the way RUC does now, where they control.
Oh, the reliability capacity.
Yeah, the reliability.
Not the flexible capacity.
Yeah, not the flexible.
But the flexible capacity is the flexi ramp. And
right, so the reliability energy, I guess, will be deliverable.
Right.
The stuff we're procuring over or under it for up and down. I mean,
and that's what's causing the operators, I think, to do this stuff is because they, and that's, I think I've said it. The NISO and other ISOs are paying you to track it. We still see a zero shadow price of a flexi ramp in real time, even when we need it, because we got free flexi ramp where it can't be dispatched.
Right, and so I guess.
So what do the operators do? They say, well, I've actually got, my brake is disconnected, so I think I better do something.
Right, and the ISOs, they are trying to make it somewhat deliverable with the regions, but a lot of the problem, I think, is small. It's not that you can't, it's not like below the pocket necessarily, but it could be, you could just be stuck behind a local transmission string you can't get out. And I don't think having a couple regions, 5, 6, whatever it's going to be, is going to solve that problem.
Right. I think this is the thing we're going to have to see if we can solve it in real time. And until we can solve it in real time, we can't say we solved it in the day-ahead market, because if we can't solve it in real time, we'll never be able to solve it in the day-ahead market. So.
Yeah, and I guess that was one of the points that Ryan just walked off, but has been making for a while is if we don't get the real time right, and we do a second day ahead, what value are we actually getting?
Right.
And so we think that there should be more of a move, hopefully, to look at the real time and see if they can make some changes and fixes.
Agree totally. That's part of what I was getting at. But we have to make FlexiRamp work in real time before this is going to work.
Thank you.
Carrie Brantley, Western Power Trading Forum. Just wanted to say that was pretty much our exact comments when this first came out. Fix real-time flexible ramp, add it to the day ahead, make it all deliverable, and then we'll have a great idea on what design makes sense, your option 1, your option 2, or something else. But until you actually get the flexi ramp working and in the market, I think it's really hard to empirically determine which design option is the best.
But there are long lag times in developing this stuff, so we might have to do the two in parallel. But we have to do them in parallel. We can't wait too long to fix the real time.
Well, don't forget EDAM, right? So we have a third parallel track there.
Okay.
Thank you, Scott. This takes us to our third and last substantive agenda item. So, Gabe, we're going to be talking about default energy bids for storage under ESDR 4 with a focus on cycling costs. And I just posted the shortest presentation you've ever seen, one slide. That's because it's copyrighted material that can't be posted on the ISO website. I will be showing a slide of that material later. So it will be, my presentation is actually 2 slides, which will follow his.
All right. I guess I'm signaling here the beginning of the end. Okay, yeah. So as Ben said, I'm going to talk about...
Churchill said this may not be the beginning of the end, but it's the end of the beginning.
Yeah, something. We are talking about storage default energy bids. This is something that we're taking on in the ESDR 4 initiative. And for everybody who doesn't know, I'm Gabe Murtaugh, Senior Infrastructure and Regulatory Policy Developer here at the ISO. But essentially today we'll talk about sort of the items that we've been discussing in ESDR 4 through that initiative. And essentially I've just outlined a few high-level bullet points to walk through. First of all, there'll be a little bit of background on storage resources in the ISO system and sort of the direction we see them heading, storage resource costs, modeling constraints that we have here in the ISO with our current market systems and designs, And then finally, and this is sort of the meat of the presentation, we'll go through 2 different proposals for how we could potentially model cycle depth costs. And one of them has to do with applying or attaching a multiplier to the specific state of charge for the resources, and the other is attaching a multiplier to a change in state of charge from one interval to the next interval. So getting into the presentation, in the ESDR 4 initiative, the ISO is proposing to implement a default energy bid for storage resources. Currently, there is no default energy bid for storage resources. This isn't such a huge problem, as I think the ISO currently has about 150 megawatts of storage installed on the system. So that's grid-connected, utility-scale batteries. It's not including anything behind the meter. However, I will say that there's a considerable amount of storage that's sort of in the interconnection queue to potentially join the ISO system, and also the CPUC in their most recent RA proceeding has been discussing potential RA shortfalls in the next few years, and potential mitigation measures to address those shortfalls may include procurement of additional storage resources. So there may be much more storage coming onto the system in the next few years if something like that does happen. If that were to happen, we'd want to start thinking at least about default bids and how we would treat storage resources in the system, and try to have our hands around marginal costs for those resources. So that's sort of what we're trying to tackle here. Storage, in addition to the RA issues that I brought up, storage has also been proposed as sort of a solution for local issues. There's a resource retiring and a transmission project may be expensive, or it may take a long time to implement. A storage resource may be proposed as a stopgap solution. We've also just included here, generally, when we've been modeling storage resources to date, the idea is that they take 4 hours. Usually to qualify for RA, you have to determine what the battery is capable of for a 4-hour period. That determines the RA levels for the resource, and that the proposed or theoretical operations for the battery is then moving a 4-hour chunk of energy from the bottom of the net load curve to sort of the peaks of the net load curve. And that's generally what we're thinking about batteries operating on in the system when we're proposing these sort of ideas about implementing and developing new batteries. But by and large, that's not what we're seeing the existing battery fleet do. DMM's had some analysis on this in their most recent annual report. And then policies also put together some updated figures for the first half of 2019. By and large, we don't think that that's an issue with the market or an issue with the default energy bids per se. Generally, these storage resources are looking for a particular spread greater than their marginal costs, and generally, we don't think that the current marketplace provides for those spreads, particularly for deep discharges for storage resources. Yeah, Mike.
Hey, Gabe, this is Mike Castellano, CPUC. So the last workshop we had for ESDR, SCE had a presentation that showed that on the sample days that they showed, the market provided significantly greater spreads of prices, but that they were not able to accurately predict what those prices were going to be in the day-ahead time frame, and therefore were basically locked out of the market. They didn't, some of their examples were something like they needed, $15 or $20 between. They predicted price going down to somewhere below 25, so they set their charge bid at 25, and then price never went below 26. So they didn't end up charging, and they couldn't do anything. But then, on one of those days, or on each of those days, the price was going up into $60, $70, $100. And so, to say, I haven't done particularly more analysis than that, but from what they've shown, it sounds like there are a lot of times where the spread is there, but the strategies that they have to bid on that spread are complex and difficult because they have to predict what prices are going to be in the day-ahead market. And so, just that the spread is there from what we've seen.
Yeah, I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, but I might let Perry take a chance to respond to that because he has been working with SCE on several examples for potential bidding strategies there. And I think he's been looking at sort of what the day-ahead market does do and doesn't do in terms of, quote-unquote spread bidding.
Yeah, this is Perry. So we did follow up with SCE after that presentation. First thing, it wasn't clear to us if that spread was bid into the day-ahead market. Second thing, it wasn't clear if they were bidding that same spread all day. But looking at the chart, that's a scenario where it doesn't matter what the individual prices are in those hours. If the day-ahead market can achieve that spread over the day, whether prices are at $900 or at $25, it would dispatch a charge on the battery and discharge the battery in the same day, regardless. It would dispatch it, say, $1 out of the money now to get it $100 into the money later. That's just what the day-ahead market does. And we've been working with SCE, but we haven't yet seen a specific example where this was not the case, or where their chart showed that actually happened.
I'll have to think about that more, but I don't think that's necessarily true.
Well, any multi-interval optimization, if I could take you $1 out of the money now and get you $100 in the money later, the optimization would do that, right?
If there are no other costs, presumably, but what we've seen is that the optimization has not been doing that. So.
Right, and we're still working with stakeholders. We have not yet seen a particular example shown to us where the market failed to dispatch in that way.
I think, thanks Perry and Mike, appreciate that. I think one of the items that we will be talking a little bit more about in the ESDR 4 initiative is you might be able to do that in the day-ahead market, but there's different constraints in the real-time market, and there's less opportunity to sort of look ahead for those opportunities to arbitrage between intervals. So making sure that a resource is charged and ready for an interval possibly several hours down the road when you need it might be a bit more challenging. So I think at the very least we're going to raise that as a potential item to tackle and perhaps put forward some thoughts on how to deal with that.
Yeah, and that's specific to the real-time market.
Yeah. I agree with that. Okay. So on to the next slide. This is sort of a visual depiction of the idea that we talked about on the last slide. And the visual depiction just says, well, hey, you've got this energy here at the bottom of the net load curve, and the idea would be that if you had enough storage resources, you could sort of charge all your resources during that time, and then at a later time of the day when the net loads were greatest, so hours ending 19, 20, 21, 22, you could discharge that energy and reduce the net load peak. You might also use some of that energy to reduce the ramping needs on the way from the bottom of the net load curve to the net load peak. And then you might also, during certain times of the year, particularly in the spring, have 2 net load peak times of the day, and those might include hours ending 7 and 8 in the morning before the solar really comes online. One of the questions that's been asked is, well, if those sort of spreads in different times, prices do line up fairly well with net load curves. Why don't we see storage resources that are on the system doing this today? Well, there's a number of reasons, but primarily they're looking to capture a spread between those 2 time periods because it's expensive to charge the resource and discharge the resource. And this slide sort of goes through specific reasons why it's expensive to charge and discharge a resource. So the 4 primary costs that we've outlined and we vetted with stakeholders through the last version of our straw proposal for ESDR 4 included these costs. We did get, I'm sorry, not the last version of the straw proposal, but the last workshop we had for ESDR 4 sort of outlined these 4 costs. We did get feedback from stakeholders, and through that feedback, the stakeholders generally acknowledge that these are the 4 costs that they would be looking at when thinking about batteries, so at least we feel like we're on the right track here. Actually modeling these costs and making sure we can get them into our market software might be an additional hurdle, but that's sort of the direction that we're heading here with this initiative. So what are the costs? there's four of them. There's energy, losses, cycling costs, and then there's also opportunity costs for the resources. So the energy costs are similar to fuel costs for traditional gas generation. So unlike gas generators that take fuel and burn the fuel and turn that into electricity, storage resources take energy off of the grid, so they have to buy the energy through the energy market, and then they store that energy, and then they're able to discharge the energy and sell it back onto the grid later. So the price that you actually buy the energy at, or the price that you would have to buy replacement energy at, would impact your decision on whether or not to charge or discharge. So buy energy at 20, clearly a profit maximizing strategy is probably not to discharge when prices are below 20. There's also two different flavors of losses that we've heard about for batteries. One is parasitic losses and another is round-trip efficiency losses. For the most part, we haven't heard, like I said, a large portion of what we currently have grid connected in terms of storage is lithium-ion technology. We don't have a whole lot of other chemistries on the system, but that could change. But a large part of the storage resources that are in the interconnection queue are also lithium-ion. So we're sort of thinking about the cost in terms of lithium-ion batteries today, and that's sort of how we're planning to go forward. But the other idea would be, well, hey, if we do get a lot of batteries of a different chemistry or different technology type, we'd like to have something that accommodates those. So with that in mind, parasitic losses don't so much impact lithium-ion batteries. They're mainly subject to round-trip efficiency losses. The parasitic losses are losses when you charge a battery, say, up to 10 megawatt hours, and then slowly over time that 10 megawatt hours degrades possibly to 9.7, then to 9.5, something like that. Round-trip efficiency losses are, you charge storage resources with 10 megawatt hours of energy, and then after you charge the resource, you're only capable of discharging 9.5 megawatt hours of energy. So there's some loss in between what you actually take off the grid and what you're able to put back on the grid. So numbers we've heard from actual resources that are grid connected is this number can range anywhere from the low to mid 80% efficiencies up to perhaps 95%, give or take. And of course, every particular resource and every site is different. Parasitic losses, again, don't affect the lithium-ion batteries as much per se, but they may affect other types of storage resources. So the big component of the costs for storage resources are cycling costs, and this is what I focus most of the rest of the presentation on. So cycling costs essentially are a representation of how much a battery degrades when you run the battery. So batteries do start to deteriorate and break down. The lithium and the actual metal inside of the batteries begins to degrade as you charge and discharge the resource, much like your cell phone. So when we say cycle, we mean either running the battery from 100% state of charge down to 0% state of charge, or say running the battery from 60% state of charge down to 50% state of charge, and then doing that 10 times. Those are both equal to one cycle battery. And every time the resource cycles, there's some wear and tear on the battery, and the battery isn't as effective as it used to be. And then eventually you'll have to replace the resources, which can be very expensive. And those sort of replacement costs are what need to be modeled when you're thinking about cycling costs. And what we know, and from some of the literature that's out there, is that cells degrade faster with deep cycles. So that cycle where the resource goes from 100 megawatts down to 0 megawatts is generally much more expensive for the battery than the 10 cycles or the 10 discharge periods where the resource goes from 60 megawatts to 50 megawatts. And it may be even on the order of 10 times as expensive to do that 100% to 0% discharge. So deeper cycles generally much more expensive. So there was some discussion early on in the ESRA 4 initiative about whether or not the cycling costs should be included in the DEBs or whether they shouldn't be included in the DEBs. We really do feel like this is a variable component of the battery's operating. So if you operate the battery, you incur this cost. If you let the battery sit there and don't operate it, you don't move any energy with it, then it doesn't incur cost. So we're very much in the camp of saying, hey, look, this is something that we do need to include in the default energy bid or the marginal cost to represent this resource if we do implement something like this in our markets. And then finally, and I've already mentioned this in the previous slide, but it is expensive, or we think it's expensive for these resources to be able to capture the current price spreads in the market. So generally, 9 months out of the year, we see a price spread between, maybe around, on average, $40 between the evening bottom of the net load curve to the evening peak of the net load curve. So it's general over a 4-hour period. So it's generally not a huge amount of money, and that $40 usually is not enough money to compensate for a full depth of discharge. If it were, we'd likely see more resources bidding into the market this way and see them actually charging and discharging at those prices. Okay. Finally, we do have opportunity costs here. So if a resource is discharged by the ISO, say when energy prices are $50, and then because the resource has been fully depleted and prices at a later point in time are $100, and the resource isn't able to capture those $100 prices because the ISO has essentially depleted all of what was available to storage resources, stored energy, there's an opportunity cost there, and that also needs to be figured into the marginal cost for the resource and in the default. Okay. So we've reviewed a paper that Ben was kind enough to forward to us, and that paper has estimated costs related to cycle depth. So what it outlines is basically this relationship between cycle depth for a full cycle of the resource and actual dollars. This particular example includes a $300,000 replacement cost for the battery, and it also includes a 95% efficiency. So obviously if efficiency is less, these costs could be more. If replacement costs were more, these costs could be more as well. What we do know is that replacement costs are changing over time. So if you've got a resource that may need replacing after 10 years, that might be much less expensive than replacing storage resources after 2 years. So sort of estimating what those replacement costs would be and getting that number right is going to be an important part of modeling the cost for a battery and sort of how we think about the cost for the resource. Again, that 95% efficiency number is something, so both the replacement costs and the efficiency numbers would both be things that we'd include in the modeling, and it would be numbers that would likely be stored in a place like master file, which would be specific to each storage resource we have in our system. And this is just a sample of what one such cost curve might look like. So as we've talked about, there's a relationship between cycle depth and total cost, and then there's a relationship between cycle depth and marginal cost. If we did just a very, very simple model where we said, okay, cycle depth squared is the total cost for discharge, and then the marginal cost for that same resource would just be 2 times the cycle depth. We could come up with this chart here down at the bottom that says, well, if I have a cycle depth of just 1%, so a very small cycle depth, total cost would be 10 cents, not very much. Marginal cost would be 20 cents. And then we could sort of walk down the chart here. A cycle depth of 20 or 40 would include a total cost of 40 or 160. So it gets much larger as you do a deeper cycle. And then marginal cost would be 4 or 8 for a 20% or 40% cycle depth. And then they would increase linearly as you went up from 40 to 60 to 70, so 8, 12, 14 for their marginal cost for the resource.
Gabe, can you remind me of the units here? Are we thinking per kilowatt or megawatt hour, or is this per charge no matter how big a cycle we're talking about?
Per megawatt hour.
Okay. Yeah. And that would apply to the previous curve picture as well?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, Adam.
It's Adam Slother from DMM. If you go back to slide 6 for just a second. So when you say estimated cost and estimated replacement cost, are you talking about like cell augmentation cost or full replacement of the resource?
I'd have to double check that. I think it's cell augmentation, but I'd have to double check.
I'd say it's an important distinction to make because at the point that you're talking about reflecting the full cost of replacement of the resource as part of a marginal cost, I think that's a kind of a different paradigm and something we don't necessarily want to do. The cell augmentation, I understand, gets a little bit tricky because at some point when you've replaced all of the cells, you've essentially replaced the resource, but it seems like there's still a little bit of a distinction there, so it'd be good to clarify.
I agree with you there. I think one of the challenges we might end up having is actually estimating those cell augmentation values, and we may need to use potentially full resource replacement costs as maybe a proxy for that, but perhaps not. So far, we have reached out to several stakeholders. We've also reached out to some of the manufacturers, and we have not, we've had a lot of trouble actually nailing down real numbers. There's sort of some capacity numbers that are out there in the industry literature. A lot of it is, a lot more storage resources are used in the automobile industry than the electricity industry currently. So I think numbers are a little bit more readily available for those automobile numbers rather than the utility scale storage resources. So again, those are all kind of pieces of the puzzle that need to be parsed out, and it's relatively complicated to get a good estimate on what replacement costs might actually be. But
just so I understand this last exchange, so would the cell augmentation be more of the marginal cost that we'd be thinking of here?
I think so,
or full replacement would sort of include all the whatever aspects, and there'd be a substantial fixed cost associated with that?
There may be, yeah. Yeah, wait.
Can you go back one slide on page 5? Just for my education, what does it mean when you say it's expensive for this resource to capture current spread? Can you give an example maybe?
Sure. So, today, generally, we see a net load curve that sort of looks like this maybe 3 months of the year, right? Where we have a peak in the morning and we have a peak in the afternoon that are roughly the same number of megawatts. Most of the year what we see is that morning peak is at a much lower level than the evening peak. So generally what we see is a larger gap between the bottom of the net load hours, so that those hours where I've shaded in orange, and the hours that I've shaded in green. And generally, on average, typical day-ahead price spreads might be like $40, $45, something like that. So, we think that if the $45 really was sufficient to cover the marginal cost for a deep discharge for a solar or a storage resource, we'd see them doing that, right? So we'd see them actually charging for 4 hours and bidding in appropriately to charge for 4 hours during those orange hours, and then to discharge for 4 hours during those green hours. We don't see that in the data. We see them primarily acting or bidding into and getting cleared for ancillary services. So a lot of these resources are providing regulation energy, and we see the actual amount of charge and discharge through those regulation signals that they receive is relatively low compared to moving 4 hours of energy, storing 4 hours of energy and then discharging 4 hours of energy. And that's not true across the board for all resources, but that's true for most of the lithium-ion resources that we have in the system right now.
Okay, thanks. Just from the energy perspective.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right, yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, Grant McDaniel with Wellhead. It's not a question, it's just sort of a comment here. Just so you know, the cost of holding that energy in terms of the cycle life of the battery, if I charge it up 100% in the belly of the duct, holding it just for the evening ramp, the time that I'm holding it is also going to be an additional cost. Save it for the morning ramp the next day, that's actually more expensive than if I discharge it all that night and then I'm in a resting state of charge, it's lower throughout the rest of the day. It's just an added complication.
Yeah, okay.
The longer I hold a deep, that full charge, the faster my battery wears.
So
okay, so sorry, that is I guess you just answered my next question, but that was so it's not a charge dissipation issue, it's a battery lifetime issue. So the longer you hold the charge, you also are putting more wear on it. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, this paper that we keep referencing talks about those kinds of charges, costs as well, and it also says, well, those costs are relatively small compared to the cycle depth costs. And then I could also see sort of, you know, if you really do sort of operate in this manner where you're maybe charging to maybe say 80% instead of 100% during those orange hours, and then you discharge maybe to 50 or 40% during the green hours, maybe you are at a more comfortable state. But I think you raise a good point, because one of the other ideas that we've been talking about in terms of developing the default energy bid is, and what we're going to see here is we're going to apply, or we're thinking about applying a multiplier times a delta, your state of charge. So you sort of find out how much you're going to dispatch the resource down by, and then that sort of captures an additional cost that's going to be included when we do the market maximization problem. We've also been thinking about, I think, addressing your specific concern as well, where you have, hey, if you're at extreme states of charge, there's some sort of adder included there also, but we haven't quite worked out the details of that, and we're sort of treating that right now as a secondary problem, but I think it is something we do want to address. So if you have any more insight as to kind of what the relative value of those numbers might be, I think we'd like to hear about that and talk about those too. And if you want to provide comments in the ESDR 4 initiative, that would be helpful also. So thanks, Graham. Any other questions? Shami, anything on the phone right now? Seem to be a good call. Good point. Okay. 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 So yeah, we have sort of laid out two potential ideas on how we could, and this is what I was just talking about, but we've laid out two potential ideas on how we could capture marginal cost for resources, and specifically the marginal cost related to cycle depth. So CD here in this formula is cycle depth, and we're looking at resource I for interval T, and we've got a number of different parameters that go into the formulation for the cost for that cycle depth. Those parameters include, and just for full disclosure, I'm going to outline this model, and then I'll outline another model, and we'll kind of compare and contrast the two, and then hopefully we can collectively draw some conclusions between the two. The formulation here includes V, which is a binary variable, and it's 1 when the resource is dispatched to discharge energy, and then it's 0 if the resource is charging or if it's remaining constant state of charge. So essentially when maximum state of charge minus state of charge is positive and not changing, then or is increasing, that's when we get this adder. If the state of charge is going up, then we don't get this adder. Rho is just a constant value that's applied, and it's resource specific. Maximum SOC is specific maximum state of charge is available for the ISO dispatch. So we understand, I think as Graham was just pointing out, that these resources can be very expensive to dispatch at either extreme. So if the resource perhaps is charged above 80% or perhaps discharged below 20% state of charge, it can be very expensive to operate the resource in that range. So one of the ideas that we have to address that is perhaps just create a forbidden zone where we don't allow the resource to discharge, and for this example, maybe above 70 or 80%. And then at the same, or 80% in this case, so 80 megawatt hours on a 100 megawatt hour resource, and then we don't allow the resource to be discharged below 10 megawatt hours. So we have a total discharge range here, just in this very simple example of 70% of the resource, or from 80 megawatt hours down to 10 megawatt hours. We're going to set the Rho, just as an example, at 20, and then we'll assume the resource can achieve plus or minus 24 megawatts. And we'll assume that it's a 5-minute market. So in a 5-minute period, you can either move the resource up by 2 megawatt hours in terms of state of charge, or you can move the resource down by 2 megawatt hours. So 2% of the total state of charge of the resource in any given 5-minute interval. But there is an interconnection beyond 24 megawatts, even though an actual storage resource may be able to charge or discharge beyond those limits. So what does this mean? So this means that as I'm at different states of charge, my marginal cost to operate the resource is different. And again, we're not including the costs for the resource to actually buy the energy or to replace energy at a different time. I'm not including losses here in this model. This is just the discharge cost that we're attempting to model here. So if, perhaps after that, the lowest net load period, we're at T plus 1, and at that time, it may be, the ISO may have the choice to either, in this case, not charge the resource anymore because it's fully charged, but it may have the choice between leaving the resource at an 80% state of charge or not changing it, or beginning to dispatch the resource or discharge the resource anywhere from 0 megawatts down to 24 megawatts. If the market chooses 12 megawatts, that cost associated with that discharge would be 20 cents. If the market chooses 24 megawatts, that cost would be 40 cents. And that cost would get added to the market optimization. If we use the same model, and if over time the resource was charged and discharged throughout the day, and then there was another interval, T plus X, let's say, and the resource was now at a 20% state of charge, and the model had, again, the choice to either charge the resource at no additional cost in the cost minimization problem, or to discharge the resource from 0 megawatts or a very small number of megawatts up to 24 megawatts. 12 megawatt discharge here would cost $12.20, or a 24 megawatt discharge would cost an additional $12.40. So as you can see, once the resource moves down the state of charge, as you have less and less state of charge, the incremental costs to dispatch the resource further increases, and that's sort of what we've outlined here. Okay, so pros and cons to modeling the resource in this manner. Pros, if we assume that the cycle depths really do, let's say it's just the cycle depth squared, then we can be assured that this model will always be greater than or equal to the cost to operate the battery. This aligns with increasing marginal costs, so as you do go deeper into a discharge cycle, the costs increase, and that's what we've read in the literature. That actually happens here in this model. And then the price for any discharge increases as the state of charge decreases, and the market outcomes will tend to charge the battery because it prefers to operate the battery closer to the 80% range than the 0% range. And Graham, I think to your point, we might add something that says, well, if you're operating between 60 and 80 where it might be more expensive, there might be an additional adder there to sort of prevent the resource from always kind of going back up to the 80% state of charge or something like that. The cons to this model is that the model may actually grossly overestimate the cost to produce. So remember that cycle depth is a function of where you start your discharge from and where you end your discharge from. So if I start my discharge at 60% and end my discharge at 40%, that's a 20% depth of charge. But if I start at 50% and then charge to 60% and then discharge to 40%, well, that first discharge really is the way to model that, and the way it is modeled in the paper we've been looking at is that first 10 megawatt hours of discharge are associated with just a 10 megawatt discharge or a 10% discharge rather than, if you were starting at 80 and going down to 40% or 40% discharge. So there's a little bit of complexity there. Now, we do think that, generally we would expect a resource to largely charge up again during that lowest net load, lowest price period of the day, and largely discharge during the highest prices of the day, which tend to be blocks and not different incremental times. But that's not to say that there couldn't be low prices during certain hours of the day where the battery does charge and then discharge after that and then recharge later. Questions? Okay. Anything on the phone? Okay, great. I love it. A second option we have for modeling these costs is outlined here in this formula. So this is largely the same construct where we have a cycle depth for resource I at time t, and then we've got a U parameter which has to do with a dispatch, either positive dispatch or negative dispatch. So if you're dispatching the resource to produce energy, it's a 1, the binary variable. If you're not dispatching energy, it's a 0. Rho is still a constant value. And then instead of applying that constant to simply the SOC max minus the current SOC, what you're doing here is you're saying you're applying the rho value to the SOC during the prior interval to the SOC at this interval. So the idea here would generally be that if your dispatch is positive, your SOC is going down, so your SOC during the previous interval is greater than the SOC during your current interval because you've been dispatched down. And then whatever that difference in your SOC is applied to a particular value of rho. Again, we can make the same assumptions where we have a 100 megawatt hour resource, and we can assume that a rho value of 7 here in this model. Again, these are just totally made up numbers for easy math. And then we can assume that the resource has Pmin, Pmax plus or minus 24 megawatts, so you can be dispatched anywhere within that range. Again, these default energy bids are based on state of charge, and within any given interval, the cost to dispatch the resource varies. But over differing stated charges, the difference between costs is always the same. So in this case, if again you're at the beginning of the day, time interval T+1, and you're charged up to 80%, so you're at your maximum stated charge, you can choose to dispatch the resource anywhere from 0 megawatts down to 24 megawatts. Dispatching at 12 megawatts, again, if rho is 7, would be a total cost of $7. Dispatching down to 24 megawatts would be a total cost of $14. That same problem would come up every time you run your optimization if you're dispatching the resource. So at time T plus X, let's say the resource is down to a 20% state of charge, that same problem would be entered into the cost minimization problem, where a dispatch of 12 megawatts would cost $7, a dispatch of 24 megawatts would cost $14, and you'd be at a total cycle depth at that point of 61% or 62%, depending on the dispatch. So as you can see with this model, if you have a larger value of rho, which presumably you would in this setup compared to the first setup, you'd have very expensive cost to discharge your battery at high levels in any given 5-minute interval, whereas in the other model you might have more expensive costs to dispatch your resource low at low states of charge. Like you wouldn't get to 20% as often because the charges would get larger and larger that you'd be adding to your cost minimization. So we've got some pros and cons for this model as well. It may efficiently dispatch the resource for a given number of megawatt hours if you set your rho appropriately, and that might take some doing to work out the math to get the right value there. And you may consistently produce the correct price on average, but you might not get the right price at any given particular dispatch interval. The cons, it's going to overestimate costs for large dispatches when cycle depth is thin. So if you are sitting at that 70% or 80% state of charge, generally you won't be very deep in your discharge at that point. So prices would be relatively low to make those discharges. So generally the second model would overestimate those costs. And then it might also underestimate costs when you're very deep in it. So if you've gone all the way down to 25% state of charge or 20% state of charge, it would estimate that same range of costs. So small dispatches might actually seem relatively inexpensive compared to what the actual costs are because you've already dispatched or discharged your resource by so many percent. Okay. I think those are the two models that I have, and I will stop and pause for questions.
So, Gabe, I have some very basic questions. What exactly are the bid parameters here that you're accepting from a resource?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. So we started this endeavor by thinking about, okay, if we want to mitigate a storage resource, how would we do that? And the tools that we currently have are the bids that we have on an hourly basis, which correspond to, a megawatt value with the current bid curve today. So, as we learned that actual costs for these resources likely corresponds to depth of discharge, which is not a megawatt dispatch instruction, we've also come to the realization that, hey, we need to think about the ability for resources to bid to bid a greater value as you get deeper and deeper into your discharge. So the idea would be that bids could actually include this cycle depth parameter, as well as default energy bids that we use to calculate internally what we believe the marginal costs are for the resource.
Okay, and so I guess I'm trying to get a sense of whether there's sort of the paradigm here is a storage resource that has certain capabilities and limitations, and we're going to fit it into the 24-hour market solution in a way that maximizes something or minimizes cost, perhaps, that wouldn't look like an hour-by-hour energy bid. But it sounds like you are kind of still approaching this as kind of an hour-by-hour energy bid, but it would be adjusted by the CD, because it just seems like the CD in any given hour is going to be a function of how some other hour clears.
That's right.
And so is the CD determined endogenously as part of the market solution then?
Yep.
Okay, so and is the energy price, the energy cost also, or is that a bid parameter?
That's a good question. So the specific endogenous parameters here are the PI. So the Ps in this case are the dispatch instructions. So the dispatch instruction for each interval for a specific resource would be determined by the market solution that we arrive at. We haven't spent a whole lot of time thinking about how to calculate the costs to procure the energy for the resource, whether or not that's an estimate of what we actually think they paid for energy, or whether that's an estimate of what we think they will pay for energy. But my thinking on that currently would be that somehow that's an estimated value that we come up with, and it may change perhaps on a daily basis. But I think that's a very good question, and we haven't quite wrapped our hands around that problem yet.
Hey, Gabe, this is Perry ISO. On that other slide that you just had up, the last one that you were on, so your point was that we may, maybe one more, you had an equation on it, I think.
Oh, the other equation, yeah, sure, sorry.
Yeah, so you were saying, we may offer the ability for the market participant to bid, and I'm just trying to understand, it was bid the row value?
That's right.
So then I think from what you're saying, it would be they would bid a fixed row value, but it would be a fixed row value for the day, not an hourly changing row value.
So it'd be a little bit different than that. We would think about a row value in terms of sort of those two different factors that we talked about earlier. So replacement costs for the resource, and then for cell degradation, and then also the efficiency of the resource would be sort of factored in to sort of get the right row. That likely would be something that the ISO calculates from master file parameters. So it would be possible for resource owners and operators to change how row is calculated for the internal default energy bid calculations, but not necessarily not necessarily, impacting row per se for their resource. Now, the other thing I would add is that their bids could be different, though. They may actually put a row value in for their bids, which might not match the calculated values by the ISO that we'd use for the default energy bids. There's a lot of details there that we haven't quite worked out yet.
Yeah, I guess the first thing I thought of was if row is something that changes from day to day or not.
Yeah.
If not, it seems like it's just a master file parameter that would be an adder that we would add on to their submitted bid curve to make sure that we operate them in this
well, you'd need some ability for, I think you'd need some ability for the resources to actually bid the value for their specific bids, but then the ISO would have to come up with some sort of a value to mitigate the resources. Now, it's not clear whether or not that value we use to mitigate would be based solely on their parameters. Maybe it would be based on, you know, if we have a fleet of these things, maybe we do something with the fleet to come up with what our mitigation value would be.
Sure. So I'm just, I guess, just to clarify, so my line of questioning is just in the space of them bidding and participating, not necessarily how you're eventually going to calculate their DEV and potentially mitigate them to that value. But it, you know, so it sounds to me like row is not something that changes over the course of the day or from day to day. However, if something, you know, where I think this comes out to need to bid it, I think would really happen in the real-time market when we're not looking at a horizon that includes to the end of the day. So they may have a reason for adjusting that row value once they're participating in the real-time market.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it would be
throughout the day
that they could adjust with their bids. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, I think that the flip side of that would be that, you know, the ISO may not require storage resources to bid in this manner. You know, they may still be able to. I don't see any reason why we would restrict them from using the other.
I would think they would still use the bid curve. This is then just the additional parameter needed for us to then construct the true cost of the resource to consider in the market. Yeah.
Questions from the bench? No? Shoot, lost Ben. Anything on the phone, Shammy? No. Okay. Well, I do think Ben's up next. He's got a slide to share on this. So, okay, well, leave you to it.
Well, while we're waiting for him, I'll just ask more stupid questions. Okay, so is the general idea here then would be there'd be an energy bid that's kind of like a standing offer, and is the bid functionality such that you would clear them in one of, so I'm just still wondering the mechanics of if I want to charge in one of the hours from, say, midnight to, or I guess let's say it's 8 a.m. to 11 a.m., but not every one, and then I want to discharge in one of the hours. So these things are all solved simultaneously, and are those types of constraints honored in this kind of setup?
So I don't think in this kind of setup per se. I think you'd get a bid curve, and if the market optimization found out, oh hey, you're economic to charge for 2 of the hours because we think we know what it actually costs you to do, maybe if it's 10% per hour, a 20% charge and a 20% discharge, and that's economic to do, then the market would schedule you for that 20% charge and 20% discharge, even though you may have thought to yourself, oh hey, I'd really only like to charge and discharge 10%. So I think the idea would be that would be more of a market determination rather than a participant determination.
Right, and that would be based on some kind of cost minimization notion, based on bid-in parameters of some kind. Yeah. Okay, thanks.
That's a great question, though. The other thing that we're working on in Azure 4 is a state of charge parameter, where you may be able to specify specifically what you want your state of charge to be at the end of any given hour, and then the real-time market respects that. So if you say you want to be charged at 70% at the end of hour ending 5, you will be charged, the market will optimize you to make sure you're charged at least 70% or higher at the end of that hour.
Yeah, one of the reasons I'm asking, or I've been thinking about, I'm nervous about imposing too restrictive a dev structure on a new technology, especially when there's potentially innovation going on that might have a lot of heterogeneous characteristics across different technologies. And so I'm trying to think about so that means I would like to give a lot of headroom, but I'm not sure what headroom even looks like, Right. We have to think about the bidding parameter dimensions and so forth and how they feed back into that, in the sense of, how do we balance any potential concerns about local market power from small batteries versus, which, right now there really isn't much, but there may be in the future, versus wanting to still encourage innovation in different capabilities and so forth. And I think that tilts the balance towards, trying not to be overly restrictive on the DEBs, but I'm still trying to think about what that really means in this context.
Well, I think you're exactly right. What the ISO really doesn't want to do is, set up this framework and then have a DEB that says, oh, yeah, we're going to run this resource all the time because of the price spreads that we happen to have on any given day, and then the resource comes back to us and says, oh, hey, but my real replacement cost, if I have to replace these batteries in a year is going to be this much, and you've only given me a default energy bid that covers this much, and we're effectively, wearing out these resources when we shouldn't be. So I think you're right, perhaps erring on the side of, hey, let's get the DEB a little too high to start with, and then start to, kind of ratchet it down as we understand these costs more. And frankly, as the technology develops and perhaps, there isn't as much volatility in replacement costs for the resources. I think that's fair. Mike, do you have? Just
a real quick one in the context of what Jim was just saying there, and then your reply. I think one of the concerns here is that, in addition to we don't know what those bid parameters look like, I think there's some uncertainty about how those replacement costs are going to come about and how much they're going to be. And if we establish the DEB such that the resources get used less often, then we're going to be farther away from knowing what those real costs are.
Well, right, and I guess, so the hope is that we're setting them so that they're not constraining an ability to bid lower if the true costs are in fact lower. And so this is kind of bounding but not necessarily binding.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. Adam, do you have something?
It's Adam Swadley, GMM. So this is a discussion, that's focused on costs that come from depth of charge, depth of discharge. The other sort of discussion around maintenance cost on cell degradation has to do with number of cycles.
Yep.
So has there been, I guess, how do you link this discussion about depth of discharge to number of cycles? Do you see, it seems like there might be some kind of overlap there. But I would wonder, too, what the discussion has been and what level of consideration has been given to how those costs might be incorporated.
Yeah, we've seen in comments that is also a consideration in addition to, like, temperature you operate the resource at, frequency of the system, that sort of thing. Those all have an impact on how fast those cells degrade. So I think, that seems like, in and of itself, an easier problem to tackle than this depth of discharge piece. So I think we're trying to get our arms wrapped around the harder problem first. But I think, we're certainly going to acknowledge that that's a cost. And then, as we continue to develop this through the ESDR 4 process, we'll start to think about how we could actually put that into a default energy bid or a bidding structure.
Yes, I guess maybe that was part of the thought there, is that with the depth of charge, I don't know, I guess I see a little bit more of an argument for calling that more of a marginal cost. It's a little harder for me to wrap my head around the idea that something that's a function of the number of cycles is actually an incremental production cost. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I don't know. There's discussion there, but just a line of thought there. And I guess one sort of follow-up question, is this the full DEB proposal, or is that still under development for the other pieces, like the opportunity cost, for instance?
Very much still under development. Okay. So we'll continue to keep you updated on that and probably come back to this audience and have an updated presentation there. So yeah, we're still working on that.
I just wanted to try to follow up on the idea that it's not a marginal cost. So I guess, again, I don't know anything about the technology, but I would just assume that if the battery doesn't do anything, so there's not any cycle, then it saves that opportunity cost of a cycle, and therefore, I guess I think of that as marginal. Like if we use you for a cycle, then there's an opportunity cost, a foregone ability to cycle at some later date that is marginal to deploying you now versus later?
I think it gets to the definition of cycle. That's a term that's thrown around, I think, kind of loosely. So when to clarify what I'm talking about, it's and maybe I think this is the same definition that has come up in the ESTR 4 discussion, is a discharge or a series of discharges that totals to the megawatt-hour capacity of the battery. So if you have, a 40 megawatt-hour battery, it might be several small charges and discharges that total up to that 40 megawatt-hours, and that completes one cycle. So I guess the thought process there is that at some point over there, discharging an incremental megawatt, linking that to something that's a cost of the number of cycles, I don't know, it seems a little less straightforward to me.
It may actually also be hard to disentangle those kinds of costs, if they do exist, with the depth of discharge costs as well, so there could be some problems there.
I guess I'll have more to say about this in a moment, but to address exactly that point. Let's see if there are other questions first.
Yeah.
Just killing time? Okay. So I can take no credit at all for this presentation, except I happened to be on San Juan Island when this student was presenting his poster of what he did during his summer internship at ISO New England, and it was fascinating. And it turned out that he and his advisor, Dan Kirshen, have done a lot of work with battery folks to summarize the state of knowledge about the economic characteristics of batteries as lithium-ion batteries as of a handful of years ago. So this was written in 2016, and then now it's 3 years on, and the technology is moving quickly. This is the only slide that's posted. I have another slide that I'll show that's from the article, but it's copyrighted, so that's why it's not posted, but I'll show that in just a minute. So what I'd like to do first is summarize kind of what their conclusions are about the costs of replacement, of cycling, and how this gets translated into then what Gabe showed you, which was this quadratic function. And then I'll show the implications of approximating that function, and Gabe has proposed two approximations. But first of all, the cycling costs and what Boland's conclusions are. By the way, Boland is now a postdoc at MIT, and he's going to be on the Columbia University faculty this coming fall. This is his area of research, so keep an eye out for his future publications. So there are 5 categories of physical phenomena that result in aging of batteries or their cells, and you need to replace them earlier, that depend on how you operate that. And one of them, as Adam pointed out, is the number of cycles. And it turns out, so basically if you, lithium-ion batteries of the sort that they were looking at, if you discharge them 0 to 100% all the way down, you could do that something on the order of 500 times, and then you have to replace it. If you only discharge 10%, then you can go have 100 times as many cycles. Not 10 times as many cycles, but it turns out it's quadratic. So, for example, instead of discharging from 100% to 0, you discharge from 100% to 50, you'd get not twice as many cycles, but 4 times as many cycles. And this deals with the way that the material is that the battery cells are made out of are damaged, get coated or cracked, and other things. So it turns out that there is a close relationship then between the cycle depth you take it and the number of cycles that you can then have before you place the cell. And then if you wind up moving forward the time that you replace it, there's a bigger cost, and that's where those numbers come from. Just to look ahead, when he simulated those costs for batteries in the ISO New England system, he found that that was actually the major category of costs and had a huge impact on how ISO New England would use batteries. And I'll show that figure in a second. Okay, there are other operating characteristics that affect, lengthen, or shorten the life. For example, the current rate, how quickly you withdraw power or inject it, whether you stray, you overcharge it or undercharge it, the temperature that it operates at affects its lifetime, and then the average state of charge. If you keep it charged at a low level on average rather than a high level on average, that also affects things. And their conclusion, based on consulting with material and battery scientists 4 or 5 years ago, is that the first one, the cycle depth, is by far the dominant one in determining the lifetime. This may be different now, as Jim mentioned. The technology is changing really quickly. Of course, if we move away from lithium-ion to something else, it may be entirely different. But even within lithium-ion, this may or may not be the case. I've been communicating with Balloon and said, well, what do we know now? Is anything fundamentally changed? And he says he doesn't believe so with lithium-ion, but we should definitely keep an eye on it, first of all, and second, as Jim says, don't lock ourselves into one particular technology characterization that straitjackets us and doesn't allow us to appropriately represent these technologies in the future. So what I'm going to do now is, in the next cell, is show the impact of approximating the charging costs and effect on lifetime. So according to material scientists, as of 3 years ago, the best way to count cycles, an issue that Adam alluded to, is actually something called a rain flow counting method, which there isn't a simple formula for. But the method that results from using Gabe's quadratic function comes very close. So there's the actual way that you should count cycles that best captures the aging of materials. Then there's this quadratic function which seems to come close, which is something you can model in a dispatch and optimization model. And then, well, turns out that New England is not actually going to use the quadratic function because it's just to approximate that in a mixed integer linear program requires that you take the state of charge. Instead of having one state of charge variable, you actually divide up the capacity of the battery into little segments, say 10 of them, and have 10 state of charges for each of the little segments, and that way you can wind up having a piecewise linearization of this quadratic function. And Eugene, who's the co-author of this and the major market designer at ISO New England, says, we do amazing things with market software, but that's one thing we're not going to do. We're not going to blow up the size of our market software to accommodate the quadratic cost functions of batteries, at least not at the moment. So my understanding is, communicating with Bolu and others, is that no ISO is accounting for this nonlinearity in cycle costs. And in fact, the California ISO is the first one to consider how cycle costs might be included in dispatch. So we can't use that quadratic function, at least not at the moment, because of the cost in terms of the number of variables. Conceivably in the future, it is linear. It doesn't require binary variables, so it is well behaved, but it would increase the size of the model. So let's talk about the approximations that Gabe has proposed. Any of these approximations under a particular circumstance, operating conditions, might do really well, and then it might do really badly under others. So since they're all very approximate, you're going to want to simulate them and evaluate them and compare them. There's no, a priori, there's no way we can say ahead of time that this approximation is a lot better than that one. So, for example, Bolin in his article evaluated the second method that you showed, Gabe, which is essentially take that quadratic function and you use kind of an average slope. That's essentially what it is, and I'm going to show those results in a minute. The other method that you had, where you penalize depth of charges that are greater I haven't seen evaluated before, and it's not mathematically exact, but it may get better behavior than the one-piece approximation, and there's just no way to know ahead of time before testing it. So what I'm going to do now is show some results of balloon simulations with ISO New England of the one-piece approximation that essentially Gabe has proposed. It's the second proposal, where instead of having a shallow discharge is very low cost per unit, but a very deep discharge, you're getting up into a very painful area, very high cost per unit in the margin. Use an average slope. That was that. Remember the 7 number that he gave? We'll look at that and how that performs relative to something that has more line segments to it, which means you have more variables. So this is the figure, and again, I'm sorry that this can't be posted. However, any of you can click on this URL and get this article. So, and let's see, is there any way that I can move a mouse around to? Okay, I can't. Unfortunately, I can't indicate. For the folks in this room, I can use a laser pointer, but that doesn't help you online. So what do we have here? The top figure is the battery's state of charge over a 2-day period under different approximations. The bottom figure shows what it produces over those 48 hours. And this is looking at the real-time market in New England. So this is just 2 days, and he actually did this over an entire year. But you get a sense of what happened. So first of all, the light gray lines, that's if there is no cycling cost at all. All you have is the inefficiency. You lose 15% of the power in a cycle from charging to discharging, but there's no shortening of the lifetime at all. And you can see in the top figure, in the gray line, the battery is moving from completely discharged. Oh, actually, I believe its minimum state of charge is 15%. It can't go below 15. And it looks like it goes all the way to 95. You can see it bounces around a lot, that it looks like it hits rock bottom about 10 or 15 times and then is completely charged about 10 or 15 times in response to the volatility of real-time prices. Okay, now what happens if instead you consider cycling cost and you consider the nonlinear curve? That's the red line that's called 16 segments. On the top, what you see is what happens is that if you consider cycling cost, you do not bring it all the way up to 100%. You keep it bouncing around between 15% and about 60%, and you don't move it around quite as much. So you have fewer cycles and they're much shallower, and that really saves a lot of money, and that's optimal from ISO New England's point of view. So that's what you should be doing if you believe how the material scientists have characterized the cost of these batteries. What is that sort of wide brownish line? That's if you use Gabe's approximation. And so what happens if you assume the average cost, not the low cost if you only go 10%, not the high cost if you go 100%, but something in between. So what happens is you start out empty and then you fill it up and you keep it filled up and then you discharge it near the end. So you actually don't use the battery very much because, as Gabe pointed out, that 7 number may be too high if the optimal thing to do is to just have shallow discharges. You wind up using it less. The bottom line, okay, let's look at the power that's produced. And you can see that the gray line, that's with their no cycling cost. You're producing and charging quite a bit over the 48 hours. So it looks like something like 20 or 40 cycles. The red line shows that if you consider cycling costs, you cycle it, can I guess, it's about half as many cycles, and they're usually not as deep. You're not going bang, bang all the way from completely charged, turning it all the way on to turning all the way off. And then finally, you can see that the thick brown line, when you use Gabe's a value of 7, which is essentially what they did, you use the battery a lot less. So in this case, it looks like using Gabe's value of 7, you'd use the battery way too little. If you ignored cycling costs, you'd use it way too much. The nonlinear function gets you in the middle somewhere. Gabe's point is, well, maybe we can tune that 7. Maybe the right number is 3 or 2, and we could get something that behaves a bit better. And Gabe then also made the point that, well, maybe if we have that second method, maybe that would also use the battery better approximate the optimal way of using the battery. We don't know, and which is best and what parameters are best may depend on system conditions. What we do know is that the one-piece thing will not work for all conditions. It certainly didn't work here. Ignoring cycling costs also does not work. You really grossly overuse the batteries. And so what's going to happen is you're going to see battery owners are going to be self-scheduling to protect their assets from being overused. And maybe that's the best thing we can hope for right now is some parameter sort of in the middle that doesn't result in either extreme, and then rely on the owners to self-manage somewhat. It's not very satisfactory if they really can exercise market power, self-managing your state of charge. That's like that physical withholding. You may be able to manipulate prices just as much as with your bids. So what's the bottom line? The bottom line is that the research community is paying attention to this issue of cycling costs and has concluded that cycling costs are a major, major component of the cost of running a battery. That's why you're seeing batteries used now mainly for regulation in the California markets and not for day-night arbitrage. It is possible, in theory, to correctly accommodate all these costs, but at the expense of a much more complicated model. And in a world without market power, maybe you should just allow people to self-manage. But in a world with market power where we need to have parameters and get a sense of when people are overstating their costs or whatever, that's not going to be sufficient. So this is a very tough problem, Gabe, that you are tackling, and there may not be a clean solution, in which case we may find ourselves, just like with the default energy bids for hydro in the EIM, saying, well, we're just going to have to choose a pretty generous level because the consequences of over-mitigating may be worse than the consequences of under-mitigating, and there may be a big trade-off there. So I'll stop now and see if there are any questions in the room and then turn to the lines. Yeah.
I guess, Mike. Not so much, this is Mike Castellano, CPUC, not so much a question, but just an observation. I understand this is just 2 days, and so it's dependent on conditions and everything, but it does kind of highlight, at least in this scenario, if you look at that top, the state of charge graph, the 2-segment possibility seems to come much closer to the 16-segment than does the 1-segment. I don't know how much easier that is to implement in a mixed integer.
That's actually a great point, that you may get most of the benefit of the full, 16-segment approximation. Maybe you can get most of that with just the 2 segments, because you're absolutely right that at least the eye, that's a heck of a lot closer.
Yeah.
And whether that's generally true or not, I don't know. That's not. There's some tables in the paper that talk about the cost of the approximation. He doesn't show what happens down here. It's a messy enough chart. But so that suggests, if that's generally true, that suggests that perhaps with 2 state of charge variables per battery, you can capture most of the cycling costs.
Or
that's an interesting hypothesis.
You could at least get sort of meaningfully close enough that the rest of it, then you could maybe you know, look at, you could adjust those two a little bit and decide to sort of find where you're covering most of it and everybody's operating in a place where they're not going to be too upset.
Okay. So I have no idea how general that conclusion is, but I think it's definitely worth explaining if George and others don't blanch at the thought of having two state of charge variables. That might be a very reasonable compromise. And that might be also a basis for calculating default energy bids. So thank you for noticing that. Anything else from the room?
Ben, I will thank you very much for your presentation. I think this is good to look at, and I will say that I did, upon learning that the rainflow model could estimate those states of charge and these costs for depth of discharge, I did actually propose that to our technology team, and they basically said the same thing as the folks at ISO New England, that, hey, that's not really possible. So we've sort of gone down that path, but I think to your point, you know, using something where we have one state of charge value, or perhaps, you know, two state of charge values, that may be a possible solution for us here in our market, and it may get somewhat close to better results and actually accounting for these costs.
Yeah. I mean, if you're interested, I'm sure Bloom would be very happy to share more detailed results from ISO New England if you're interested in exploring two pieces versus others. So, anybody on the line? Okay. I've bludgeoned the listeners into insensibility. So with that, I guess I will conclude, unless anybody else has anything else to say. Okay. This brings us to our last agenda item, which is new business. Tentatively, we're having our next MSC meeting in October 11th, and the agenda items will look familiar. Of course, DAME is going to be on that, as is system market power, especially looking towards the board meeting in November. We will probably be writing an opinion on system market power, the basic idea that's going to be proposed by the ISO and perhaps others. Maybe we'll have our own. And that's all I have to say at the moment. Okay, so operator, that concludes the meeting. We can have everybody sign off. Thank you everybody very much for listening.
Thanks, Lauren.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using AT&T Event Conferencing Enhanced. You may now disconnect.